Dwayne Johnson stood in front of the TV, his eyes glued to the breaking news coverage of a wildfire that was rapidly spreading across the forested hills. Flames danced in the distance, a fiery inferno devouring everything in its path: trees, wildlife, homes, and livelihoods. The news anchor's voice crackled through the speakers, reporting the usual tragedy of lives lost and homes destroyed. But there was something about the footage that didn't sit right with Dwayne. It wasn't the flames themselves. He'd seen fires like this before, too many times in his career as a public figure and through his advocacy work. It wasn't even the damage being done to the environment. That had become far too common as well. It was something else, a small, almost imperceptible detail that had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. Dwayne leaned in closer, studying the images of the burning forest. Through the haze of smoke and flames, he saw something that made his heart race. There, just at the edge of the fire line, was a patch of land that seemed unusually untouched. The fire was raging on all sides, but for some reason, this one section seemed to be resisting the flames, almost as if it was controlled. It didn't make sense. The terrain was just as dry, the conditions just as volatile. So why wasn't it burning? His brow furrowed. He had a feeling, a gut instinct that told him this wasn't just another natural disaster. Something was off, and he wasn't going to sit back and ignore it. "Something's not right here," he muttered under his breath, his mind already racing through the possibilities. His phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was an alert from a news outlet, confirming that the fire was now categorized as one of the largest in recent memory. The fire department was overwhelmed. Evacuations were in full swing, and communities were in distress. But all of it felt like noise. Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that this fire, this tragedy, was hiding something far bigger. Something no one else had noticed. Dwayne had made a career out of standing in the spotlight, out of using his platform to inspire people to take action. He was no stranger to speaking out when something didn't sit right with him. But this was different. This wasn't just a call for more donations to fight fires. This wasn't just a plea to rally around people who had lost their homes. This was something much more personal. Without even thinking, he picked up the phone again, tapping the screen to open his social media. As his fingers hovered over the keyboard, he had an impulse, one that had been growing ever since that first strange moment when he noticed that patch of untouched land. "Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from," he typed, his voice now amplified by the vastness of the digital world. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Dwayne paused before hitting send. He wasn't just asking a question for the sake of engagement. There was something deeper at play here. The fire wasn't just a tragedy, it was a puzzle. And if he could get the world to care, maybe they would see it too. He looked back at the TV, and just as quickly, his fingers flew over the keyboard, sending out his post to millions of people across the world. The conversation had started. But for Dwayne, this was just the beginning. What if this wasn't an ordinary wildfire? What if this was a sign of something bigger, something far more insidious than anyone realized? He didn't have all the answers yet, but something inside him told him he needed to find out, and fast. "I'm going to figure this out," Dwayne whispered to himself. The journey had begun. Dwayne Johnson had always felt a deep connection to the land. Growing up in Hawaii, the ocean was never too far away, and the forests were a constant companion. His childhood had been shaped by the rhythm of nature. The way the waves would crash against the shore, the way the wind would rustle through the trees, and the way the sun would dip below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. It was a life rooted in the outdoors, where every moment was an adventure and every challenge was met with grit and determination. But the world was changing, and so was Dwayne. As a young boy, Dwayne's family had struggled. They weren't rich, but they had love, they had each other, and they had the land. His mother, a gentle yet fiercely protective woman, worked 2 jobs to support the family. His father, a man of few words but immense strength, had taught him the value of hard work. Even in the face of financial struggles, they found ways to keep their spirits high. It was in those early years that Dwayne learned the importance of resilience. Despite their hardships, the land was always there, constant and unyielding. There was a comfort in it, a feeling of security that nothing could take away. But that peace didn't last forever. When Dwayne was in his late teens, his family was forced to leave Hawaii in search of better opportunities. His father had been diagnosed with a chronic illness, and the medical bills piled up, leading to a heavy burden on their small household. Moving to the mainland was a tough decision, but Dwayne knew it was necessary. They settled in California, and it was here that Dwayne's life began to take a different shape. High school wasn't easy, and neither was the transition to the mainland. Dwayne was already a large, imposing figure. He stood out, and not always in a good way. He was bullied by some of the other kids, who saw him as an outsider. But he also found solace in sports, where he could use his strength and natural athleticism to prove his worth. Football became his escape, his outlet. It gave him purpose. By the time he graduated, Dwayne had already realized that his future lay in the spotlight. His raw talent and determination led him to the world of professional wrestling, where his charisma and unique personality made him a star. The world of wrestling opened doors for him that he never dreamed possible, and soon enough, he found himself transitioning to Hollywood. He became a global sensation, known not just for his movies, but for his larger-than-life personality, his philanthropic work, and his advocacy for causes that mattered. But as his fame grew, so did his awareness of the world around him. Hollywood, for all its glamour, often felt disconnected from the things that truly mattered. The values he had grown up with, community, integrity, and respect for nature, were slowly being overshadowed by the superficiality of fame. It was in this new world, amid the glitz and glamour of Los Angeles, that Dwayne's deep-rooted love for nature began to resurface. He started getting involved in environmental causes, using his platform to raise awareness about the impact of climate change and the importance of preserving the planet for future generations. But it wasn't just about raising awareness. Dwayne's connection to the land, to the forests, to the oceans, was personal. He didn't just want to be an advocate for change. He wanted to make change. In 2019, Dwayne had been an outspoken advocate for disaster relief efforts after wildfires ravaged parts of California. He had donated money, helped raise funds, and used his social media to spread the word. But even then, in the aftermath of those fires, Dwayne felt like something was missing. Something wasn't right. The devastation of the land and the loss of homes was heart-wrenching, but as he stood at the edge of the fire zones, he couldn't help but wonder, was it just a random act of nature, or was there something more at play? That same feeling stirred again as he watched the news coverage of the fire that had erupted this time. The strange detail he had noticed, the untouched patch of land, brought him back to that moment. It was as if the fire itself was being manipulated, and it felt eerily familiar to something he had seen years before. Dwayne's mind began to race again. The fire wasn't just another natural disaster. This was something planned, something intentional. He couldn't put his finger on it yet, but he knew that whatever had started this fire, whatever had made it spread so unnaturally, needed to be exposed. But why him? Why now? Dwayne had built his career on confronting the impossible, on taking on the roles that no one else dared to, from action-packed blockbusters to heartfelt moments that resonated with audiences. This felt like another challenge, one that had nothing to do with fame or glory. It wasn't about him being a movie star. It was about being a man who had always been willing to fight for what was right. This fire, this disaster, was his fight, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. Not this time. He turned away from the TV, his eyes narrowing in determination. There was work to be done, and it wasn't going to be easy. But Dwayne had never shied away from a challenge. The question was no longer why he was going to investigate the fire. The question was, how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? Dwayne knew it wasn't going to be a simple task. The world was going to doubt him, question him, and tell him to stay out of it. But his instincts were screaming louder than ever before. And so, with a resolve he hadn't felt in years, Dwayne Johnson took his first step into what would become the most important journey of his life. There was something about the wildfires that no one else had noticed, and Dwayne Johnson was going to find out what it was, no matter the cost. The next morning, Dwayne woke up with a feeling of urgency weighing on his chest. The fire was still raging, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt like there was a piece of the puzzle just out of his reach. It wasn't enough to just donate money or post a few words of encouragement on social media. He needed to dive deeper, to see this with his own eyes. Grabbing his phone, Dwayne quickly typed out a message to his team. "I'm heading out to see the fire zone in person. Let's make sure we get all the details, fire locations, local shelters, and key responders. I need to know everything." He didn't wait for a response. There was no time. Within a few hours, he found himself on a plane to Northern California, where the wildfires had been wreaking havoc. The devastation was beyond anything Dwayne had ever seen. From the air, it looked like an apocalyptic scene. Miles of land charred black, billowing clouds of smoke rising into the sky. The fire had claimed hundreds of homes and thousands of acres of forest, displacing entire communities. It was heartbreaking, overwhelming. When he landed, Dwayne was greeted by a local emergency responder, a woman named Jessica, who had been tirelessly working in the evacuation zones. "Mr. Johnson," she greeted him with a tired but determined smile. "I've seen your posts. Thank you for bringing attention to this. The people here need all the help they can get." Dwayne gave her a nod, his eyes scanning the scene around them. "I'm here to do more than just talk. I need to understand what's really going on, why this fire is different." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Different? What do you mean?" Dwayne didn't want to sound crazy, but he couldn't ignore the strange feeling in his gut. The fire, it's not behaving the way fires usually do. There are areas where it's spreading faster than it should, and some patches of land that are completely untouched. It's almost like someone is controlling where it goes. Jessica looked at him, her expression softening. "We've seen it too. There are places where the fire doesn't make sense. It'll skip over a house, but then suddenly rage through another block. It's like it's following a path, but we don't know what that path is." Dwayne's mind raced. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't just some out-of-control wildfire. This was something deliberate. And if it was intentional, that meant someone had orchestrated it. "I need to talk to the people who've been here from the beginning. The fire chiefs, the investigators," Dwayne said. "I need all the intel I can get." Jessica nodded. "I can set up some meetings for you. But be careful, Dwayne. People here are on edge. There's a lot of speculation, and not all of it's helpful." Dwayne smiled, a touch of his trademark confidence returning. "When has that ever stopped me?" The two of them set off toward the local fire command center, where the chaos of coordinating evacuation efforts was in full swing. First responders, volunteers, and local officials were frantically working together, trying to keep the flames contained. But no one seemed to be talking about the odd patterns of the fire. Dwayne knew something was missing from the official reports. People were doing their best to manage the crisis, but they were also too close to see the bigger picture. That's where he came in. Inside the command center, he was introduced to Chief Sam Carter, a veteran firefighter with a reputation for staying calm under pressure. "Mr. Johnson, I appreciate you coming out here to see the damage for yourself," Chief Carter said, shaking his hand. "It's a mess, to say the least, but we're doing everything we can." Dwayne didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Chief, I've been looking at the fire from the air, and I've been talking to people on the ground. Something's off. The fire is behaving strangely. Are you seeing anything like that on your end?" Chief Carter's face hardened. "You're not the first person to ask about that. Some of the responders have been talking about it too. Fires don't usually spread like this, not with the intensity and speed we're seeing. There's something about it that doesn't sit right. But I can't prove anything. It's all speculation." Dwayne's instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't just a wildfire. This was something more. But the question was, who could be behind it? And why? He needed answers. And he needed them fast. The conversation with Chief Carter gave him a few leads, but nothing concrete. Dwayne's frustration was growing. He knew that the official story, the one everyone was running with, wasn't the whole truth. But there was still a missing link, something that could help him connect the dots. Later that evening, as Dwayne sat alone in his hotel room, he stared out at the darkened sky, his mind racing. Every news station, every report, was covering the fire. The human cost, the destruction of homes and lives. It was all tragic. But the more Dwayne thought about it, the more he realized that the tragedy wasn't just the fire. It was the reason behind it. And the more he looked into it, the more he felt like he was getting closer to uncovering something that could change everything. He tapped out a quick post on social media. "I'm here in California, seeing the aftermath of this fire firsthand. But there's something I'm not seeing in the news reports. Something feels off. Stay tuned. We're not just talking about a natural disaster here. There's a bigger story, and I'm going to find it." Dwayne sent the message and set his phone down, his thoughts focused on the task ahead. The fire was just the beginning. The real story was out there, and Dwayne was determined to uncover it. He had no idea how far this investigation would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until he had the answers. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. The next few days were a blur of interviews, investigations, and meetings with local officials, firefighters, and survivors of the wildfire. Dwayne had made it his mission to dive deeper into the situation, but the more he learned, the more questions surfaced. People were overwhelmed, yes, but there was also a sense of unease in the air. A feeling that things were not as simple as they appeared. One thing became crystal clear. There was a pattern to the fire's behavior that no one could explain. It wasn't just the speed of the spread. It wasn't just the erratic direction in which the flames had moved. It was something even more peculiar. The fire seemed to be following specific routes. Some homes were completely spared, while others were obliterated in the blink of an eye. It was as though the fire had a purpose, a method to its madness. And that didn't sit right with Dwayne. He couldn't shake the thought of the untouched patches of land, the areas where the fire simply stopped, almost as if it had been blocked off, as though someone or something had created an invisible barrier. While everyone else was focused on the immediate destruction, Dwayne began to focus on the details that no one else seemed to notice. He spent long hours poring over satellite images, looking for anything unusual, patterns, anomalies, a reason why the fire behaved the way it did. It wasn't until late one evening, when he sat alone in his hotel room studying a series of aerial shots of the fire zones, that he saw something. A sequence of images showed the fire spreading through a small town at the heart of the fire zone. But there was a gap, a specific area where the fire had completely bypassed. Dwayne zoomed in on the coordinates and compared it to nearby images from the past week. It was a large plot of land that, according to the satellite data, had been completely untouched by the fire. It was as if the flames had deliberately avoided it. Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a coincidence. There was something deliberate at work here. He pulled out his phone and immediately called Jessica, the local emergency responder he'd met when he first arrived. "Jessica, I need to know everything about that plot of land," Dwayne said as soon as she picked up. "The one that hasn't burned. What's there?" She was silent for a moment. "You're talking about the old estate on the west side of town, right?" Dwayne's eyes widened. "That's the one. Tell me more." "It's an old property. Belongs to a man named Edward Hale. He's not exactly a local, keeps to himself mostly. He's been buying up land in the area for years, though, quietly expanding his holdings. People around here talk about him, but no one really knows what he does with the land." "Is Hale connected to the fire somehow?" Dwayne pressed, his mind spinning with possibilities. "I don't know," Jessica said, her voice taking on a cautious tone, "but it's strange. The fire's been burning for days, but that property, Hale's land, has been untouched. No smoke, no flames, nothing. You should go see it for yourself." Dwayne wasn't sure what he was expecting, but something about this Hale character intrigued him. A wealthy man with mysterious land holdings in the middle of a fire zone? That was enough to make anyone suspicious. "I'm on my way," Dwayne said, already grabbing his jacket and heading out the door. The drive to the estate felt longer than it should have. The sun was setting, and the land around him was still smoking, still blackened from the fire. But as he neared the estate, a strange calm washed over him. The winds had died down, and the air seemed clearer here, almost too clear. The estate was nestled on a hilltop, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown brush. From a distance, it looked like any other high-end property, sprawling, secluded, and rich with natural beauty. But the closer Dwayne got, the more he realized something wasn't right. There was no sign of the usual chaos. No firefighters, no rescue teams, no scorched earth. Just pristine, untouched land. Dwayne parked his car near the estate's wrought iron gates, which were eerily closed. He stepped out and approached them, his gaze locked on the property beyond. There were no signs of life, no smoke rising from the trees. It was as if the fire had completely skipped over this place. And yet, it didn't make sense. He checked his phone, hoping to find more information about Edward Hale, but nothing substantial came up. Hale seemed to operate in the shadows, with very little online presence. No social media, no big corporate holdings, just a name attached to several properties around the area. It was almost like Hale was hiding. As Dwayne stood there, contemplating his next move, a figure emerged from behind the estate's front gate. A tall, middle-aged man with a sharp suit and calculating eyes stepped toward him, his gait purposeful. "You must be Dwayne Johnson," the man said with a faint smile. His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was an undertone of something colder. "Edward Hale," he introduced himself, extending a hand. Dwayne took his hand, but didn't shake it immediately. He studied Hale, sensing that the man was far more than he appeared. There was something in his eyes that made Dwayne uneasy, something that suggested he knew exactly why Dwayne had come. "I've heard about you," Dwayne said, sizing Hale up. "You've got quite the estate here. Funny, though, it doesn't seem like the fire has touched this place." Hale's smile didn't waver. "I've been very fortunate, Mr. Johnson. This land has been in my family for generations. I take great care to preserve it." Dwayne didn't buy it. "Preserve it? This land is in the middle of a wildfire zone. There's no way you just got lucky." Hale's eyes flickered for a second before he quickly regained his composure. "Luck has little to do with it. I've simply made the necessary preparations." Dwayne knew there was more to the story, and Hale was hiding something. "What kind of preparations?" Hale gave a small, polite shrug, still with that unnerving calmness. "I believe in the preservation of both nature and business, Mr. Johnson. That's all I'll say." Dwayne wasn't going to let it slide. There was too much about this man's land, his position, and the fire itself that didn't add up. He needed more answers. "Careful with your words, Hale," Dwayne said, his voice low. "The more you hide, the more I'll dig." Hale's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Feel free to look around, but I wouldn't recommend going too far. Some things are better left untouched." As Hale turned and walked back toward the house, Dwayne stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. There was something sinister going on here, something tied directly to Edward Hale, and Dwayne was going to find out what it was, even if it meant digging deeper into this mystery than anyone else dared to. The fire was only the beginning. And Hale? He was a key player in whatever was unfolding. The following morning, Dwayne found himself once again standing at the gates of Edward Hale's estate, though this time, he wasn't just a visitor. He was on a mission. Hale had given him nothing but vague statements, leaving Dwayne with a growing sense of unease. He wasn't a man who liked mysteries left unsolved, especially when the stakes were as high as they were now. The fire that ravaged parts of California was no accident, and Hale's strange connection to the untouched estate seemed like a clue that Dwayne couldn't afford to overlook. With a silent determination, Dwayne approached the gates once more. This time, however, he wasn't alone. He'd called in a favor from an old friend, Jackson Reed, a former Navy SEAL who now worked as a private investigator. Jackson was known for his ability to get into places people didn't want him to be, and he was just the kind of person Dwayne needed for what he had in mind. "Ready?" Dwayne asked when Jackson pulled up in an unmarked van, the kind of vehicle that could blend in with nearly any environment. Jackson grinned, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the estate. "Always. But just so we're clear, this could get us into some serious trouble." "I'm counting on it," Dwayne replied, a spark of defiance in his eyes. "We're not here for a vacation. We're here to find out what Hale's hiding." The two of them pulled on their dark jackets and approached the back of the estate, where the high stone walls seemed less monitored. Dwayne's mind was racing, piecing together everything he had learned about Hale and the fire. Something told him that Hale wasn't just some rich, reclusive landowner. There had to be more to him. And the land he had been collecting for years? It had to mean something. "Let's move quickly," Jackson said as they reached a narrow gap in the fence. He pulled out a set of lockpicks and swiftly disabled the alarm system. Within moments, they were inside. The area beyond the gate was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. As they moved through the estate's gardens, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But every corner they turned, every step they took, the place seemed more and more abandoned. No staff, no security, just an unsettling calm. Jackson led the way toward a small, nondescript building at the far end of the property. It wasn't a house or a barn, but something else entirely. The closer they got, the more Dwayne realized that it was some kind of research facility, though it was old and looked somewhat dilapidated. It stood out as an anomaly amidst the otherwise pristine estate. "This looks like the place," Dwayne whispered, his voice low. Jackson nodded, his face serious. "I don't like this. It's too quiet. If there's anything here, it's being hidden for a reason." The building's exterior was covered in ivy, almost as if it had been left to decay by design. They moved closer, Dwayne's senses on high alert. Jackson motioned for him to follow, and they carefully approached the back entrance. It was locked, but not well. With one swift movement, Jackson picked the lock, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and stale air. The room was dimly lit by a single overhead light that flickered intermittently. Dwayne felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he scanned the room. It looked like a small lab. Old equipment covered in cobwebs, paper files scattered across a desk, and what appeared to be blueprints pinned to the walls. But what struck Dwayne most was the large map hanging on the wall. It was a detailed topographical map of the area around the estate, with multiple red markings drawn across it. The markings seemed to indicate key locations, some of which coincidentally aligned with areas where the wildfires had been particularly aggressive, while others corresponded with the untouched zones that Dwayne had noticed earlier. He stepped closer, his mind racing. "This is it. This is the link I've been looking for." Jackson moved over to the desk and started sorting through the scattered papers. "Looks like Hale's been doing more than just collecting land. This research, it's all about controlling the land around the fires. The map, the fire zones, it's like he's been predicting where the fires would spread." Dwayne couldn't believe what he was hearing. "He's been controlling the fires?" "It seems that way," Jackson replied. "But how and why? This isn't something anyone could do with just fire breaks and fire trucks. This looks like some kind of experiment, like they've been testing the land, setting boundaries, and seeing how the fire reacts." "Experiment?" Dwayne repeated, his voice incredulous. "Hale's been orchestrating these fires?" "It's starting to look that way," Jackson said grimly. "But we need more information." Dwayne turned his attention back to the map, his finger tracing the red markings. There was something about them that felt intentional, like someone had carefully selected these spots for a reason. He stepped back and looked at the papers scattered on the desk. One document caught his eye, a file labeled Project Phoenix. "Here," Dwayne said, pulling the file from the desk. He flipped it open, and his eyes narrowed as he scanned the contents. The document was a detailed report, and the more Dwayne read, the more horrified he became. It outlined a series of experiments that involved controlling and manipulating wildfires in order to assess their environmental impact. The goal was to create controlled burn zones, using fires to test the resilience of different areas of land and to see how ecosystems responded. But there was something darker underneath the surface. This wasn't just about nature. It was about control and profit. Dwayne's heart raced as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about preserving the land. It was about manipulating the land for financial and political gain. Hale had been using the fires to test new ways to control vast areas of land and resources, all while lining his pockets. "Jackson, this is bigger than we thought," Dwayne muttered, slamming the folder shut. "We need to get out of here. Now." They made their way back toward the exit, but as they reached the door, Dwayne froze. He could hear footsteps approaching. "They're here," he whispered. Jackson didn't hesitate. "We've got to go. Fast." The two of them bolted out the back, running through the shadows of the estate as quietly as they could. Dwayne's heart raced as they neared the exit. He couldn't afford to be caught now, not when he was so close to exposing the truth. As they emerged back onto the road, Dwayne's mind was already racing ahead to what needed to be done. Hale's experiment wasn't just some hidden science project. It was part of a much larger operation, one that had cost lives, and one that could cost even more if Dwayne didn't act fast. He turned to Jackson, his expression fierce. "We're going public with this. Hale's been manipulating the wildfires, and we've got the proof." "This is just the beginning." Jackson nodded. "Let's make sure it's the end for Hale." The fire had been only the spark. Now, Dwayne knew the true firestorm was about to begin. And this time, it wouldn't be stopped until the truth was out. Back at his hotel room, Dwayne didn't waste any time. His adrenaline was still pumping, his mind sharp and focused on the gravity of the discovery. Hale had been manipulating not just the fires but the very land itself, all while pulling the strings behind a carefully orchestrated plan that could have wide-reaching consequences. The stakes were higher than ever. Dwayne sat at the desk, surrounded by scattered papers, satellite images, and notes from his meetings with local officials. He knew that the evidence was damning. Project Phoenix was real, and Hale's involvement in the wildfires was anything but accidental. The firestorm wasn't just a tragedy. It was a calculated move in a much larger game. The sound of his phone buzzing cut through his thoughts. It was Jessica. "Dwayne, I've got something for you," she said, her voice urgent. "I don't know if you've seen the latest reports, but there's been a shift. People are starting to talk. More fires are popping up in areas that Hale's property is connected to. It's like the fire zones are expanding in ways we didn't expect." Dwayne's mind spun. More fires? He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "What do you mean? Are you saying there are more fires outside the areas we thought Hale had control over?" "Exactly," Jessica confirmed. "It's as though the boundaries Hale's been using to control these fires are breaking down, and now the fire's starting to spread uncontrollably to new locations. The authorities are overwhelmed. People are beginning to question whether this is still just a natural disaster or if someone is stoking the flames." Dwayne's pulse quickened. If people start connecting the dots between Hale and the fire's erratic behavior, this could turn into a full-blown scandal. "We need to act fast. Where's the biggest flare-up happening?" Jessica hesitated for a moment before answering. "There's a new fire near a small town, Elk Ridge. It's directly next to Hale's estate. It doesn't make sense how it started. The fire jumped across multiple natural fire breaks. Something is off." Dwayne's instincts flared. "I'll head over there right now. Keep your ear to the ground, Jessica. This could be the breakthrough we need." He hung up and stood up from the desk, his mind racing. Jackson, who had been quietly examining some of the files they had retrieved from Hale's lab, looked up at him. "Where to now?" he asked. "Elk Ridge," Dwayne said, determination hardening his voice. "Hale's been manipulating the fire lines, and now it's gotten out of control. We need to see what's happening on the ground before this thing spirals any further." The drive to Elk Ridge was long and tense. The wildfires had turned much of the landscape into a smoldering wasteland, and the roads were filled with evacuees, local residents, and emergency responders. As Dwayne drove, he couldn't help but notice the increasing number of burnt-out vehicles, abandoned homes, and homes that, remarkably, had been spared again, in the same way that Hale's estate had been untouched. "Dwayne, we're getting close," Jackson said, scanning the horizon. "I can see the smoke in the distance. This one's bad." Dwayne nodded but didn't slow down. His mind was racing with questions. If Hale had engineered this fire, what was his endgame? What was the purpose behind controlling the land in such an extreme, dangerous way? And now, with the fires spreading into new areas, who was going to be able to stop him? When they finally arrived in Elk Ridge, the scene was chaotic. The fire had spread faster than expected, with dense smoke hanging heavy in the air. The flames were licking at the outskirts of the town, but what stood out to Dwayne was the eerie quiet of it all. There was no mass evacuation, no sirens or emergency vehicles heading into the area. The people here seemed almost resigned to the fire, as if they had already given up. Dwayne and Jackson parked their car and approached the nearest firefighter, a young man with a worn face and tired eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Is it true?" Dwayne asked. "This fire, did it start the way they say?" The firefighter shook his head, his eyes weary. "No, sir. It's not natural. The fire spread so quickly, it bypassed natural barriers. And now it's heading straight for the town." "What caused it?" Jackson asked, his voice firm. We don't know, the firefighter admitted. It shouldn't have happened. The fire broke all the patterns we've been seeing. It's like someone set it in motion, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Dwayne's chest tightened. Who would do something like this? The firefighter looked around nervously, making sure no one was listening. There's talk. People are saying it's linked to Hale. His property's nearby, and ever since these fires started, strange things have been happening around there. No one really knows what he's up to, but we've all heard the rumors. Dwayne felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was bigger than he had thought. Hale's influence wasn't just on the land. It was on the people, on the very course of events that had led to this moment. We need to find out who else knows about Hale's involvement in this, Dwayne said to Jackson, his voice low but urgent. The more people start connecting him to the fire, the less time we have before this thing blows wide open. Jackson nodded. Let's talk to the locals. Find out what they know. This whole thing's about to get way messy, eh? Dwayne and Jackson spent the next few hours talking to local residents, emergency responders, and anyone who had seen anything unusual. The more they heard, the more Dwayne began to piece together a troubling pattern. Hale's name was being whispered more and more, especially after the recent fire had jumped across natural fire breaks and spread into areas previously untouched. Some residents had even reported strange vehicles in the area. Others claimed they had seen Hale himself at odd hours, watching the fire's progression from afar. But the most alarming reports came from a small group of survivors who had managed to escape the town's outskirts just as the fire closed in. They spoke of figures moving in and out of Hale's property, coordinating efforts to steer the fire's path. Something wasn't just off about the fire. It was deliberate. I think we're dealing with more than just a man trying to make a profit, Dwayne said to Jackson as they walked back to their car. This is a calculated act of destruction. Hale's got a plan, and it's bigger than any of us realized. Jackson's eyes narrowed. So now what? We keep pushing, Dwayne said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. We expose Hale for what he really is, and we do it before anyone else gets hurt. As they made their way back to the car, Dwayne knew this was just the beginning. The firestorm wasn't over. In fact, it was only just starting to burn. The fire raged on, but for Dwayne, the bigger fire was the one burning within him. The need to uncover the truth about Edward Hale and his role in the chaos. The more they dug into Hale's activities, the more twisted and dangerous the web became. It wasn't just about land, wealth, or influence anymore. It was about control. Control over the land, the fire, and ultimately, the people who lived in the wake of both. Back at their temporary base in a rundown motel, Dwayne and Jackson pored over the evidence they had gathered. Satellite images, witness statements, and documents from Hale's private research facility all pointed to a chilling truth. Hale was orchestrating a larger scheme, using the fires as a tool to reshape the landscape and, by extension, the very power structures of the region. Dwayne took a deep breath and looked at Jackson. We need to get this into the right hands. If we don't expose Hale soon, we risk losing control of the narrative. People are starting to notice, but we need more than just rumors and whispers. We need undeniable proof. Jackson nodded, his expression hard. I agree. We've been working in the shadows too long. It's time to make some noise. Before they could make their move, Jessica called again. Dwayne picked up quickly. Dwayne, you're not going to believe this. Jessica's voice was breathless. We've got a full-on investigation happening now. The state is sending in investigators, and the media is starting to ask questions. This could blow up. Dwayne felt a surge of hope mixed with anxiety. That's good news, right? Jessica hesitated. It's good, but it's also dangerous. The more attention this gets, the more people will be watching. If Hale gets wind of this, he'll cover his tracks faster than we can blink. We need to get ahead of him, Dwayne. He looked at Jackson, who had been silently listening in. We can't let Hale control the narrative. It's time to play our hand. Dwayne wasn't just thinking about making a public statement or taking the case to law enforcement. No, what he had in mind was much bolder, taking the fight directly to Hale. If Hale had been hiding behind his influence, his wealth, and his manipulation of the media, it was time to strip those layers away and expose him for the mastermind he truly was. But the more Dwayne thought about it, the more he realized they would need a plan. Not just any plan. A well-coordinated, strategic move that could shake Hale's empire to its core. We need access to Hale's communications, Dwayne said, his voice low but steady. We need to know who else is involved in this, who's been helping him cover this up, and most importantly, we need to find out how deep this goes. If Hale's been controlling the fire, who's been helping him do it? Who else stands to gain? Jackson raised an eyebrow. You think Hale's got a network? People on the inside who've been working with him? Absolutely, Dwayne replied. A man like Hale doesn't operate alone. He's got connections, allies in high places. We need to find them. They spent the rest of the night gathering intel on Hale's possible contacts, business associates, local politicians, environmental groups that might have been involved in his covert operations. The deeper they dug, the more Dwayne realized how intricate Hale's web truly was. The next morning, Dwayne and Jackson made their move. Armed with as much information as they could gather, they decided to infiltrate Hale's operations directly. Hale was a master at keeping his cards close to his chest, but Dwayne wasn't going to let him hide anymore. The stakes were too high, and Dwayne had made a vow to the survivors of the fire. He wouldn't let Hale get away with it. I'm going to need your help getting into Hale's inner circle, Dwayne said to Jackson. We'll have to be careful, but I'm counting on you to get us access to people who know what's really going on. Jackson's eyes gleamed with determination. You got it. I've got a few contacts who might be able to help with that. Let's see if we can't get an invitation to one of Hale's high society events. If we get close to the right people, we can find out everything we need. Dwayne nodded. We'll need to move fast. We can't give Hale any time to react. The plan was risky, but they didn't have many options left. They needed to gather intel from those who were closest to Hale, and they needed it fast. The media frenzy was growing by the minute, and Hale would be on high alert soon. Within days, Jackson had arranged a meeting with one of Hale's business associates, a high-profile environmental consultant who worked closely with Hale's development projects. The meeting was set to take place at an exclusive fundraiser for wildfire relief, hosted by none other than Hale himself. It was the perfect opportunity. Hale would be there, surrounded by influential figures who could potentially shed light on his connections. But they had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and everything they had worked for could come crashing down. The night of the fundraiser, Dwayne and Jackson dressed in their finest clothes and slipped into the glittering event like they belonged. It was a far cry from the tense, smoke-filled streets of Elk Ridge, but it was exactly where they needed to be. They were about to dive headfirst into the heart of Hale's world, and they couldn't afford to be caught. Inside the lavish venue, Dwayne felt the weight of the situation pressing on him. Hale's world was a far cry from the one Dwayne had known, a world of wealth and privilege, where every conversation seemed carefully measured and every handshake was calculated. But Dwayne was a man who had walked in the most dangerous circles before, and this wouldn't be any different. Stick to the plan, Dwayne whispered to Jackson as they moved through the crowd. Jackson gave him a sharp nod, his eyes scanning the room for their contact. Just remember, we're here for information, not a fight. They found their target, a well-dressed woman named Miranda Cole, standing near a lavish spread of appetizers. Jackson approached her with the ease of someone who belonged, introducing himself as a fellow supporter of wildfire relief. Dwayne hung back for a moment, watching the conversation unfold. It wasn't long before Miranda invited them to join her for a more private conversation away from the main crowd. Follow my lead, Jackson murmured to Dwayne as they followed Miranda into a quieter, more secluded lounge. Miranda sat down and gave them both a scrutinizing look. So, what brings you two into my circle? You don't exactly look like the usual donors. We've got a common interest, Jackson said smoothly. Hale's been making waves in the wildfire relief efforts, and we wanted to learn more about his work. We've heard there's more to it than meets the eye. Miranda's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained guarded. Careful with that talk. Hale has many powerful friends. If you're not careful, you might find yourselves in deeper than you want. Dwayne leaned in slightly, choosing his words carefully. We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to understand what's really going on. There's been a lot of talk about Hale's land holdings and his connection to the fire zones. What's your take on it? Miranda didn't answer immediately. She glanced around to make sure no one was listening before speaking in a low voice. You don't know what you're asking. Hale is more than just a landowner. He's been playing both sides, using the fires as leverage for his development projects. But it's not just about making money. There's a much bigger game he's playing, and if you're not careful, you'll get caught in it too. Dwayne's heart pounded. This was the break they needed. What kind of game? Miranda sighed, her face filled with a mixture of fear and regret. I don't know everything, but there's something going on in those fire zones that isn't just about environmentalism. It's about power. And Hale's pulling all the strings. You'll have to be careful. If you dig too deep, you might end up as another casualty of his experiment. The conversation was just beginning, but already Dwayne felt like they were getting closer to the heart of Hale's dark operation. They needed more answers, more proof, but one thing was certain. Hale had underestimated how far Dwayne was willing to go. The fight for the truth had only just begun. As Dwayne and Jackson left the private lounge, the weight of Miranda's words hung heavy in the air. Hale wasn't just a businessman or a property developer. He was playing a dangerous, long-term game, manipulating not just the environment, but the people and resources around him. Whatever he was planning, it was far more intricate and far-reaching than either of them had anticipated. Jackson's face was set with determination, but Dwayne could see the worry behind his eyes. The clues were beginning to piece together, but they were still working with fragments. They needed more, and they needed it fast. Hale's operation was growing, and with each passing day, more lives were at risk. Miranda was right about one thing, Dwayne said as they navigated the crowded hallways of the fundraiser. We need to dig deeper, but we also need to be careful. Hale has too many people on the inside. If we push too hard, we could become targets. Jackson nodded, his jaw tightening. But we can't back down now. We're not just fighting for the truth. We're fighting to stop something much bigger. Whatever Hale's doing with those fires, it's only going to escalate. The two men made their way back to their car, where they briefly discussed their next steps. Dwayne knew they needed more concrete evidence, something irrefutable that would expose Hale's involvement in manipulating the wildfires and his hidden agenda. But how could they get it? I think it's time to infiltrate Hale's operations directly, Dwayne said, his voice filled with resolve. If we can access his private records, his communications, his financials, anything, we'll have the smoking gun we need. We just have to find a way inside. Jackson raised an eyebrow. You're thinking of breaking in? Not exactly, Dwayne replied. We're going to use someone he trusts. That night, they set up a meeting with another one of Hale's insiders, a woman named Sophie Bradford, a former colleague of Hale's who had worked closely with him on environmental policies. According to their intel, Sophie had become disillusioned with Hale after a series of shady dealings, and she was ready to speak out. Dwayne had his doubts about whether they could trust her completely, but if she was their key to unlocking the final pieces of the puzzle, they had to take the risk. Meeting Sophie wasn't easy. She was cautious, always looking over her shoulder, but eventually, Dwayne convinced her to meet him in person. She agreed to meet them in a quiet park late at night, away from prying eyes. When Sophie finally arrived, she looked over her shoulder nervously before approaching them. Her eyes were dark with fear, and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. I don't know how much longer I can stay quiet, she said, her voice hushed. I've seen things that aren't just unethical, they're criminal. Dwayne leaned in, his voice low and firm. What exactly have you seen, Sophie? We need to know what's really going on with Hale. Sophie looked around again, making sure no one was listening. She then pulled a small folder from her bag, holding it out to Dwayne. I've been gathering evidence for months. Hale's been using the wildfires as a cover for his real plans. The fires were set intentionally in key areas where he had real estate holdings. But it's not just land. It's about something bigger. Hale's been using the fires to manipulate insurance claims, divert government funding, and cover up the fact that he's been dumping hazardous materials in those areas. Jackson looked at Sophie, his eyes widening. Are you saying Hale's been using the wildfires to hide environmental crimes? Sophie nodded, her face grim. That's just the tip of the iceberg. He's been working with corrupt officials, taking money from charities meant for wildfire relief. He's been laundering funds through fake nonprofit organizations. And if that wasn't enough, he's been using the chaos to push through development projects that would have been impossible to get approved under normal circumstances. Dwayne's blood ran cold. This is far worse than we thought. He's turning a natural disaster into his personal gold mine. Sophie looked down at her hands, as if weighed down by the enormity of what she was revealing. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I know too much. But you need to understand, I don't have much time. Hale's people are watching me. If they find out I've been talking to you, they'll come after me. Dwayne didn't hesitate. We'll protect you, Sophie, but we need everything you have. If we're going to take him down, we need the full picture. Sophie handed over the folder, and Dwayne quickly skimmed through it. The evidence was explosive: insurance documents, financial records, emails between Hale and government officials, and photographs of the hazardous waste sites Hale had been using. It was more than enough to expose Hale's criminal activities, but they still needed to figure out how to bring it all to light without tipping off Hale in the process. We'll get this into the right hands, Dwayne said, his voice unwavering, but we need to make sure it's airtight. We're going to have to move quickly. As they drove away, Dwayne's mind raced. They had the proof, but now they had to navigate the treacherous waters of exposing someone as powerful and dangerous as Hale. There was no turning back now. They had to act fast before Hale realized what was happening. They met with Jessica the next morning and briefed her on the new evidence. She was equally stunned by the depth of Hale's corruption, but her focus was clear. We can't go public with all of this at once. If we hit him too hard, he'll bury us before we even get started. We need a strategy, a way to leak this information gradually, piece by piece. Dwayne nodded. You're right. We need to keep Hale off balance. If we can get the media on our side and expose his ties to the wildfires and environmental crimes, we'll weaken his grip. With Jessica's help, they began to strategize. They contacted a few trusted journalists who had been following the wildfires closely, sharing select pieces of evidence that tied Hale to the disasters. They fed the story in small, controlled leaks, ensuring that no one piece of evidence would be enough to expose everything all at once. But even as they worked behind the scenes, Dwayne knew that the real battle was just beginning. Hale was no fool. He would catch wind of the leaks soon enough, and when he did, he would stop at nothing to protect himself. The fight wasn't just about exposing him. It was about surviving the war he would inevitably wage to cover his tracks. Sophie had given them the key to bring Hale down, but it was up to them to ensure that the truth didn't die in the ashes of the wildfire. Dwayne's heart raced as he prepared for the next phase of the fight. They were playing a dangerous game, but Dwayne had never backed down from a challenge before. And this time, he was determined to win. Dwayne's mind was a whirlwind of plans and calculations, but there was one undeniable truth that hung heavy over him. They had exposed Hale's secrets, but the real battle had yet to begin. The carefully laid leaks into the media had started to pick up traction, but Hale's response, his inevitable retaliation, was only a matter of time. The next few days were a blur of strategy, media briefings, and tense conversations. The wildfire news coverage was still dominating the headlines, but now, whispers of corruption, manipulation, and environmental crimes were starting to take center stage. The once protective silence surrounding Hale was beginning to crack, and Dwayne could feel the pressure building. Every move had to be calculated, every word had to be precise. One slip-up, and Hale's vast network of influence would turn on them like a trap. The morning after their meeting with Jessica, Dwayne and Jackson sat in their usual corner of the rundown motel, surrounded by stacks of documents, satellite images, and burner phones. The weight of their mission pressed on them, but there was an air of quiet anticipation, too. They were on the brink of something big. You think Hale knows what's coming? Jackson asked, his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. Dwayne didn't answer immediately. His mind was on the larger picture, the delicate balance they were walking. Hale had too many resources, too much power. Dwayne knew Hale was meticulous, and the media leaks alone wouldn't be enough to bring him down. They needed a smoking gun, something so irrefutable that even Hale's connections couldn't protect him. I'm sure he's aware, Dwayne finally said, glancing up at Jackson, but he's probably too focused on damage control to act just yet. If we can keep the pressure on, if we can hit him with everything we've got, he'll be too distracted to retaliate effectively. Jackson raised an eyebrow. You're playing a dangerous game, Dwayne. If he comes after us... I know, Dwayne interrupted, a hard edge to his voice, but we don't have a choice. If we don't push now, we lose. They had no intention of backing down. Not after everything they'd learned. Not after the lives that had been lost and the people still suffering in the aftermath of Hale's schemes. The plan was clear. Continue feeding the media with information, enough to keep the story alive and build momentum. The financial documents Sophie had provided were a goldmine. They showed Hale's ties to illicit development projects, environmental violations, and the web of corruption that had funded his empire. They needed to make sure the pieces of the puzzle came together, exposing him for the mastermind he truly was. That evening, as Dwayne and Jackson prepared to make their next move, a call came through. It was Jessica. "Dwayne," she said, her voice tight. "Something's happened. Hale's been scrambling. He's trying to cover his tracks, but there's a twist. Someone leaked the information to the authorities. The state's investigating." Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. State investigators? Who? "I don't know yet, but this is big. Hale's got his people in the government, but this leak is too massive. They can't ignore it. The fire zones are on their radar, and they're starting to connect the dots to Hale's business dealings." Jackson glanced at Dwayne, his expression one of cautious optimism. "This could be the break we need." Dwayne nodded, but his mind was already racing. "Keep pushing the story, Jessica. We need the investigation to go public as soon as possible. Once that happens, Hale's going to go on the defensive." Jessica hesitated. "But be careful, Dwayne. Hale's not just a businessman. He's a survivor. If he senses we're closing in, he'll do anything to bury us." "I know," Dwayne replied, "but it's too late to back off now." As soon as the call ended, Dwayne's focus sharpened. They were at a critical juncture. The investigation had been kicked into high gear, and soon, Hale's empire would begin to crumble. But it wouldn't happen easily. Hale would fight back with everything he had. They had to be ready. The following week, things escalated quickly. News of the investigation spread like wildfire. No pun intended, across the media. State officials were now looking into Hale's connections to the wildfires and the millions in development funding that had mysteriously disappeared. The pressure was mounting, and Hale had begun to make public appearances, his smooth talk hiding a desperation that Dwayne could see through. But the more Hale talked, the more mistakes he made. Dwayne and Jackson carefully analyzed each of Hale's statements. His body language, his words, his evasions. Everything was a tell. It was clear that Hale was in damage control mode. He had to be feeling cornered. And that was when Dwayne knew. Now was the time to strike. Jackson was in touch with their contacts in the press, pushing them to focus on the contradictions in Hale's statements. But they needed something more, a final piece of the puzzle that would prove once and for all that Hale was directly responsible for manipulating the fires. If they could tie him definitively to the catastrophe, the public outcry would be impossible to ignore. "We need to go straight to the source," Dwayne said, his voice firm. "We need to get access to Hale's personal files, the ones we know he's been hiding." Jackson nodded. "I've been working on that. We might be able to get into one of his safe houses. But it's risky." Dwayne's jaw clenched. "No risk, no reward. If we want to end this, we have to be willing to go all in." The plan was set. Late one night, they drove to a secluded property on the outskirts of the city, one that Hale owned under a series of fake names. Jackson had managed to track down the location using the digital breadcrumbs Hale had left behind. It was a secure, heavily guarded facility, but that didn't scare Dwayne. They had a window of opportunity, and they weren't about to let it slip away. With the help of their inside contacts, they managed to breach the security system. It was a high-stakes operation. One mistake, and it would all fall apart. But Dwayne wasn't about to turn back now. The adrenaline surged as they slipped past guards and entered the building, moving swiftly through the darkened hallways. Finally, they reached a small office, locked behind a steel door. Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest as Jackson went to work on the lock. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to get caught. The door creaked open. Inside, they found what they were looking for: Hale's private files. They were meticulous, encrypted, and scattered across multiple hard drives and paper documents. But Dwayne had no time to waste. They didn't need every file, just enough to nail Hale once and for all. Jackson quickly started copying the relevant data while Dwayne kept watch. His mind was focused, But the reality of what they were doing was starting to sink in. If Hale found out they were here. But there was no time to dwell on that. Jackson finished, and they made their exit as quickly as they had come in. As they drove away, Dwayne couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. They had the proof. They had Hale's empire in their sights. But now, the real war was about to begin. The world wouldn't be ready for the storm they were about to unleash. The evidence was in their hands, irrefutable, damning, and more extensive than they had anticipated. Hale's private files contained not just records of his financial misdeeds and environmental violations, but also a web of shady connections to political figures, business moguls, and even international operatives. It was clear that Hale had built a labyrinthine empire, one that spanned far beyond the wildfires he had engineered for personal profit. But Dwayne knew this was just the beginning. The real battle lay in how to use this information without tipping their hand too early. By the time they returned to their makeshift base, Jackson was practically vibrating with the adrenaline from their successful break-in. "We've got him, Dwayne," Jackson said, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is it. This is the smoking gun." Dwayne sat down at the small desk, sifting through the files. His fingers grazed over the data, his mind already plotting their next move. "This isn't the end yet," Dwayne murmured. "It's just the first step. Hale's not going to take this lying down. He's going to retaliate." Jackson's face darkened. "And what if he goes after Sophie? We can't let him hurt her." Dwayne's eyes narrowed, the weight of responsibility pressing on him. "Sophie knew the risk when she helped us. But you're right, we need to make sure she's safe. The more pressure we put on Hale, the more likely he'll lash out. We have to keep her out of harm's way until this is over." The plan was now clear. They had to push the evidence into the public eye, and fast. The state's investigation into the fires had gained traction, but without the complete picture, it wouldn't be enough. Dwayne knew they had to use the media to their advantage. Feed the public enough of the truth to force Hale into a corner, where he would have no choice but to try and cover his tracks, all while watching his empire crumble in real time. They didn't waste time. The next day, they made their move. Using Jessica's connections, they began leaking the critical files to the most trusted journalists, ensuring that the narrative would hit the news in waves, not all at once. They couldn't risk Hale making a full counterattack before the story reached critical mass. With every new article, the walls started closing in on Hale. But it wasn't long before Hale's people began to notice. A series of ominous, threatening messages started to flood Dwayne's phone. Anonymous, cryptic, and chilling. They were meant to intimidate him, to warn him off, but Dwayne had faced bigger threats in his life. Hale had no idea who he was dealing with. "I knew it was coming," Dwayne muttered as he read one of the messages aloud. "You're playing with fire. Back off, or it'll get worse." He paused, his gaze hardening. It's just a matter of time before Hale makes a move. He's too dangerous to let this slip. Jackson clenched his fists. "What do we do now?" "We keep moving forward," Dwayne said, his voice cold and determined. "Hale's not going to intimidate me. He thinks he has the power to crush us, but we've got something he doesn't, truth. And that's a weapon he can't control." The next few days felt like a tense, drawn-out game of chess. The media leaks continued, and with each new revelation, Hale's public image began to crack. What had once been a smooth and calculated facade was now riddled with cracks, and the pressure was beginning to mount. But Dwayne knew Hale wouldn't go down without a fight. It wasn't just about the wildfires anymore. It was about protecting a legacy built on lies, manipulation, and greed. Meanwhile, Jessica kept her ear to the ground, feeding Dwayne and Jackson updates on Hale's reactions. As expected, Hale was playing the role of a victim, denying all accusations, calling the investigation a political witch hunt. But the more he denied, the more the public began to question his credibility. Dwayne knew they couldn't let up now. They had him rattled, but it wasn't over yet. And then came the first real sign of retaliation. It happened late one evening, when Dwayne received a phone call from an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he answered it. "Dwayne," a voice on the other end said. It was low, menacing, and unmistakably familiar. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you're going to take me down with a bunch of documents and lies? Let me make one thing clear. You have no idea what you're messing with." If you continue down this path, you'll regret it. The voice was Hale's. Dwayne's grip on the phone tightened. You're right about one thing, Hale. I don't think I know what I'm messing with. But I do know this. You're running out of time. And you're running out of options. So go ahead, make your move. But just know this. When it's all over, you'll be the one left holding the ashes. There was a brief silence on the other end, before Hale laughed. It was a cold, empty laugh that sent a shiver down Dwayne's spine. We'll see about that, Hale said before hanging up. Dwayne let the phone fall into his lap, staring at it for a moment before turning to Jackson. It's starting. He's going to make a move. He's too desperate not to. Jackson's jaw clenched. So, what's next? Now, Dwayne said, his voice steady, we take the fight to him. The plan was set. With Hale threatening retaliation, Dwayne knew it was time to step up the pressure. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. The investigation was gaining momentum, but the longer they let Hale control the narrative, the harder it would be to take him down. They began to contact sources within Hale's circle, former employees, disgruntled business partners, anyone who might have information that could bring him down once and for all. The trick was to keep everything under wraps, while quietly building a coalition of people who had been burned by Hale's manipulations over the years. Dwayne wasn't interested in just exposing Hale. He wanted to dismantle his entire empire, piece by piece. But then, just as they were moving forward with their plan, a shocking piece of news came through. The state investigation had expanded further than anyone had expected. Not only were they looking into Hale's dealings with the fires, but they were now investigating the possibility of homicide, particularly regarding the people who had died in the blaze. The stakes had just gotten much higher. The entire world was watching now, and Hale's position was becoming untenable. There was no more hiding. Dwayne felt a flicker of something deep inside him. Satisfaction, maybe. But the feeling didn't last long. He knew the battle wasn't over. Hale was cornered, and desperate people do desperate things. The final confrontation was drawing closer. The media storm had reached a fever pitch. The public outcry against Hale's empire of deceit and manipulation had grown into something unstoppable. The leaks, the investigations, the evidence. Everything was building toward a climactic moment. But Dwayne knew that this was just the calm before the storm. Hale had fought back with every tool at his disposal, from public smear campaigns to bribes, but it was clear he was losing ground. Desperation was beginning to seep into his every move, and that made him dangerous. Dwayne sat at the motel, the weight of the coming days pressing heavily on him. Jackson was reviewing files, his face tense, while Dwayne traced his fingers along the rim of his coffee cup. The evidence was solid, the investigation was snowballing, but Hale had an uncanny way of staying a step ahead. He had deep connections, too many for Dwayne's comfort. Anything new from Jessica? Dwayne asked, his voice sharp. Jackson glanced up from his laptop. Yeah, actually. The state's pushing for charges against Hale, but they're still gathering more evidence. But there's a problem. Hale's lawyers have started pulling strings. They've been silencing whistleblowers, people who could testify against him. There's a rumor that they're preparing to discredit the investigation entirely. Dwayne's mind raced. We can't let that happen. If they manage to bury this, we'll lose everything. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. What do you suggest? We're pushing all the right buttons, but if Hale's got people in the right places. Dwayne stood up, his eyes hardening with resolve. Then we need to make sure he has nowhere left to hide. He knew what had to be done. Hale's influence was deep, but there were still cracks, and Dwayne was going to exploit every single one of them. They couldn't rely on traditional tactics anymore. They needed to hit Hale where it hurt the most. His reputation? The media had been the first step, but now they needed to go straight to the heart of Hale's business empire. To do that, they needed access to his board of directors, his major investors, and anyone with enough power and wealth to bring Hale down once and for all. Dwayne wasn't naive. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was time for the final push. He needed leverage, and that meant playing Hale's game, but better. The next day, they received a tip that Hale was planning a secret meeting with a group of investors at a secluded private property. The details were vague, but Dwayne knew this was their chance. It was a long shot, but if they could infiltrate that meeting, They could expose Hale's dirty dealings directly to those who held the power to ruin him. If the investors knew just how deep Hale's corruption ran, they would have no choice but to pull their support. "We have to move fast," Dwayne said as he gathered the team. "This could be our only chance." Jackson nodded. "I'll get the vehicle ready. You focus on the logistics." Dwayne had already been preparing for this moment. He'd reached out to one of Hale's former associates, a man named Richard Phelps, who had been quietly disillusioned with Hale's underhanded tactics. Richard had once been one of Hale's top financial advisors before falling out of favor, but now he was a key ally. Phelps had been eager to help take Hale down, though he'd been keeping a low profile to avoid drawing attention. He was the one who had tipped them off about the meeting. "I'll be there," Richard had assured Dwayne, "but you have to act fast. Hale won't give you long once he knows you're after him." It was a risky plan, but Dwayne had no choice. If they were going to succeed, they needed to get into that meeting and find a way to make the investors see the truth. That night, under the cover of darkness, Dwayne and Jackson approached the secluded estate. It was a grand, isolated property hidden in the hills, far from prying eyes. They had planned their entry carefully, using the cover of a nearby security system that had been deactivated by one of their contacts inside Hale's operation. It was a delicate process, but Dwayne was used to working under pressure. They had to be in and out before anyone realized they didn't belong. As they crept through the property, Dwayne's heart raced. They were close now. The investors were in the main house, deep in discussion with Hale. Dwayne had to move quickly. He needed to get a visual on the meeting, document the exchange, and get out before Hale could react. Inside the mansion, Dwayne and Jackson split up. Jackson was to cover the security cameras and intercept anyone who might be suspicious, while Dwayne made his way to the meeting room. It was a bold move, but they couldn't afford to waste time. Dwayne moved through the hallways like a shadow, careful not to make a sound. He finally reached a small, secluded study that overlooked the main meeting room. He positioned himself just out of sight, listening carefully. Inside, Hale's voice was unmistakable. "You're all here because you understand what's at stake. These fires aren't just a business opportunity. They're a way to reshape the future. A future where we control the land, the resources, the power. This isn't just about money. It's about creating a new order." Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. He had heard enough. Hale was laying it all out. His entire plan for world domination, wrapped up in the chaos of natural disasters and greed. If Dwayne could get this on tape, it would be enough to bring Hale down for good. But before he could make his move, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the room interrupted Hale's speech. "You've got to be kidding me, Hale." It was Richard Phelps. Dwayne's heart dropped. This wasn't supposed to happen. Richard was supposed to be on their side. But now he was standing there, confronting Hale in front of the investors. "This isn't what we agreed on," Richard continued, his voice laced with anger. "You've been using us, manipulating everything and everyone for your own gain. The fires, the development, the lies. It's all coming to an end." There was a long silence, followed by Hale's icy response. "You think you can stop me, Richard? You think you can expose me after all these years? You're nothing." Richard's reply was firm, a moment of courage in the face of Hale's wrath. "I've already told them everything they need to know. It's over." Dwayne's pulse quickened. He had to act. He moved quickly, recording the conversation on his phone, capturing every damning word. He was just about to turn and leave when Hale's voice cut through the air, colder than ever. "You've made a mistake, Richard. You'll regret this." But Richard wasn't backing down. "The only regret I have is not doing this sooner." Dwayne and Jackson were out of there in a flash, their mission complete. They had the evidence, everything they needed to end Hale's reign of corruption once and for all. The next day, as the story broke, Dwayne knew that there was no turning back. Hale was cornered. The public had heard it all. His plans, his greed, his manipulation. The investors were pulling out, and the investigation was intensifying. But Dwayne knew this was only the beginning of the end. Hale would fight with everything he had. But Dwayne wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side. And with that, he would make sure that justice was finally served. It was time to bring down the kingpin. The storm was coming. And this time, Dwayne was ready. The world had started to turn on Hale. The news outlets, once his allies, were now broadcasting the truth. The investors, his lifeblood, were pulling out, one by one. The once unshakable empire Hale had built was beginning to crumble. Dwayne could feel the shift, the moment when the tides turned against him. But even as the momentum seemed to favor him, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that Hale was still a threat. The man had too many resources, too much power. Desperation could make someone do dangerous things. And Dwayne knew that Hale wasn't the kind of man to give up quietly. It was late evening when Dwayne received a phone call from Jessica. Her voice was laced with urgency, and Dwayne's gut twisted as he answered. "Dwayne, you need to listen to me," Jessica said, barely able to keep her composure. "I don't know how he found out, but Hale knows we've got the evidence. He's making moves, dangerous ones. People are going missing. People who used to work for him, people who knew too much. And now I'm worried about you." Dwayne's pulse quickened. He'd been expecting retaliation, but this felt different. "What kind of moves?" "I don't know," Jessica continued. "But we've crossed a line, Dwayne. Hale's panicking, and when he panics, people get hurt. I think he's going to try to cover his tracks, and that means you're in his sights." Dwayne's mind raced as the gravity of the situation hit him. Hale wasn't just about to lose his wealth. He was about to lose everything. And if it meant taking others down with him, Hale wouldn't hesitate. The stakes were higher than ever. "Listen to me, Jessica," Dwayne said, his voice steady. "We're taking him down, and we're not backing off now. But I need you to lay low. Stay out of sight for a while. You've done enough. Let me finish this." "I'm not going anywhere, Dwayne," Jessica replied, her tone resolute. "I've come this far, and I'm not leaving you to finish this on your own. We're in this together." Dwayne smiled, the connection with Jessica solidifying even more in that moment. She was just as committed as he was. He had to protect her, though, protect everyone who had put themselves at risk to expose Hale's crimes. "I appreciate you, Jess," Dwayne said, his voice softening, "but this is dangerous. I'll keep you updated, and we'll make sure Hale's empire falls. Just stay safe." The following day, Dwayne and Jackson gathered in their safe house to strategize their final move. With the evidence out in the open, Hale was running out of time. The public pressure was mounting, and the investigation was growing more intense. But Dwayne knew that Hale still had a few tricks left up his sleeve. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act fast, Hale might just find a way to escape his fate. Jackson, ever the optimist, tried to reassure Dwayne. "We've got him, Dwayne. There's no way out now. The media's all over him, the feds are circling, and he's lost the support of his backers. This is it. This is the end for Hale." But Dwayne wasn't so sure. Hale's dangerous when he's backed into a corner. He's not going to go down quietly. We can't let our guard down. They had one last piece of the puzzle to complete: getting Hale to face the consequences for the deaths caused by his fires. The stakes had grown even higher now that homicide charges were on the table. Dwayne knew they couldn't leave anything to chance. They spent the next few days making sure every angle was covered. The final phase of the plan required the involvement of the highest level of law enforcement, the kind of attention Hale could no longer escape. As Dwayne met with the agents assigned to the case, he could see the determination in their eyes. They were ready to bring Hale to justice. But Dwayne also knew that they would need his help to tie everything together, to ensure that Hale couldn't slip through their fingers once again. "I've got one last thing to do," Dwayne said, looking at Jackson. "We need to get the full picture, everything from the top down. It's not enough just to bring him in for the fires. We need to expose his entire operation, from the blackmail to the corporate espionage to the lives he's destroyed. If we leave any stone unturned, he'll find a way to come back." Jackson nodded. "And you're sure about this? He won't stop until we're all gone." "I know, but we've come this far," Dwayne said, his voice firm. "It's time to finish this." That night, Dwayne and Jackson took one last trip, one last mission to bring Hale down. They weren't going to take any chances. They had to gather everything they needed to seal the deal. Inside the lavish corporate office building, Hale's final bastion, they carefully infiltrated the area, avoiding security and gathering intel. Dwayne's pulse raced as they moved swiftly, aware that this could be the moment everything went sideways. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far. And then there it was. The last piece of the puzzle, a hidden file, tucked away in a locked cabinet, containing a list of every illicit deal Hale had made over the years. From the fires to bribery to connections with criminal organizations, everything was there. Dwayne felt a surge of relief, knowing that with this file, Hale's fate was sealed. As Dwayne backed away from the cabinet, ready to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Dwayne and Jackson froze, hearts pounding. They were too late. Hale had arrived, and he was no longer hiding in the shadows. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, Dwayne?" Hale's voice came from the darkness. Dwayne turned, facing the man who had once seemed invincible, the man who had thought he could manipulate and control everything. "I didn't think I could outsmart you," Dwayne said, his voice calm. "I just knew that the truth would always catch up with you." Hale's face twisted in rage. "You have no idea what you've done, Dwayne. You've made a grave mistake. You've crossed me, and you'll pay for it." Dwayne didn't flinch. "You're already paying, Hale. You're just too blind to see it." The final confrontation had arrived. The police arrived soon after, and Hale was taken into custody. The evidence was overwhelming, the truth undeniable. His empire, built on lies and destruction, had collapsed. But Dwayne knew that it wasn't just about bringing Hale to justice. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their actions. As Dwayne walked out of the building, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. Hale's reign was finished. But in the silence of that moment, Dwayne realized that there was more work to be done. There would always be more people like Hale, people who thought they could play God with the world. But as long as there were people like Dwayne fighting back, they would never succeed. And as he looked out at the horizon, Dwayne knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice had just begun. The aftermath of Hale's downfall was almost surreal. The public outcry was deafening. Reports of his crimes spread across every news channel, every major newspaper. The fires, the manipulation, the lies, all exposed for the world to see. It felt like the world had taken a collective breath, holding its collective consciousness in the grip of a new truth. Dwayne stood at the center of it all, and yet the storm was over. There was no more running, no more hiding for Hale. He was behind bars, awaiting trial for his actions. But for Dwayne, the victory was bittersweet. Dwayne spent the next few days sorting through the wreckage of the investigation. Journalists were knocking on his door, desperate for a piece of the story. Law enforcement agencies were calling to express their gratitude. And somewhere in the background, Hale's remaining loyalists were beginning to scramble, trying to salvage what was left of his empire. But Dwayne wasn't interested in accolades or praise. He didn't even want to talk to the media anymore. His phone rang constantly, but it wasn't the calls that occupied his mind. It was the faces of the people whose lives had been irrevocably altered by Hale's greed. The victims. The families of those who had perished in the wildfires. The workers Hale had discarded along the way. They were the real heroes of this story, not him. He had spent years fighting this battle, building up to this moment, but now that the war was won, the silence seemed deafening. Jessica had been the one to find him in the chaos, standing alone by the window, staring out at the city below. "You're quiet," she said softly, stepping into the room. Dwayne turned, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" she asked, walking over to stand beside him. "About how everything's changed. How much we've lost in the process. I thought taking Hale down would make it all better, but," he trailed off, unable to put the right words together. Jessica placed a hand on his shoulder, offering the comfort he hadn't realized he needed. "It's okay to feel that way. You did what was right, Dwayne. But that doesn't mean it's easy. You've carried a lot of weight for a long time." He nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, and now I'm not sure what to do with all of it." For a long moment, they stood there, the city lights twinkling in the distance, as if offering their own quiet reassurance. The battle was over. The victory had been won. But Dwayne was still trying to come to terms with it all. "I just feel like there's more to do," he said quietly. "Like this doesn't feel like the end. Not for me. Not for anyone." Jessica smiled, her expression warm. "Then don't make it the end. You've always had a purpose, Dwayne. You've always been the one who stood up when others wouldn't. The world needs people like you." Dwayne let out a heavy sigh. It's not just about me. It's about what comes next. The people who are still out there hurting, the ones who won't be able to move on because Hale's empire left a trail of destruction in its wake. Jessica squeezed his shoulder. You can't fix everything, Dwayne, but you can make a difference. And you will. You always do. The room was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. Dwayne didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel the weight lift from his shoulders, just a little. In the following weeks, as Hale's trial began, Dwayne stayed in the background, allowing justice to play out in the courts. His role had been instrumental, but now it was in the hands of the law. Hale was facing charges for a myriad of crimes, ranging from arson to corporate fraud to manslaughter. The media circus surrounding the trial was intense, and the courtroom drama was unlike anything Dwayne had ever witnessed. But through it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of the puzzle left to solve. It wasn't just Hale who had caused the damage. Hale had been a cog in a much larger machine, and Dwayne had seen enough in his time working with Jessica and Jackson to know that there were other dangerous people out there, other forces waiting for the right moment to rise again. One day, as he walked out of the courthouse after yet another long day of hearings, Dwayne ran into an old friend, Agent Mike Taylor, one of the FBI agents who had worked with him on the case from the beginning. Dwayne, Mike said, offering a firm handshake. You're a hard man to find these days. Looks like the world is finally waking up to the mess Hale made. Dwayne smiled but didn't feel the victory he expected. It's a start, but there's a lot of work left to do. Mike raised an eyebrow. You've already done more than most could, but I know what you mean. Hale was just a piece of a much larger puzzle. Exactly, Dwayne said, his voice growing more serious. There's still something bigger at play, something that people like Hale are just the beginning of. I don't trust that the world is truly safe just because one man's in prison. Mike chuckled, though it was clear he agreed with Dwayne's assessment. The world never stays safe for long. There's always someone else willing to take the place of the one who falls. But you're not alone in this, Dwayne. There are more of us on the lookout now. Just be careful. You've made a lot of enemies. I've made my peace with that, Dwayne said with a wry smile. I'll be careful, but the fight isn't over. Mike nodded, clearly understanding. Good luck, man. And if you ever need backup, don't hesitate to reach out. As Dwayne drove back to his temporary home, he reflected on what Mike had said. The battle against Hale might have been won, but Dwayne wasn't naive enough to think it was over. The world wasn't just going to sit back and heal itself. There were always more forces at play. And it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about keeping the fight alive, for all those who couldn't fight for themselves. Dwayne had become a symbol of that fight. He had shown people that no matter how powerful or untouchable someone seemed, there was always a way to bring them down. But his work wasn't finished. It never would be. As long as there were people who needed help, people who were being exploited, he would be there. And with that realization, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. It was time to look ahead, to face whatever new challenges were coming his way, and to fight for the world he wanted to see. As the sun began to set, Dwayne knew that the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The weight of the world had shifted, but Dwayne felt it still pressing on his shoulders. The fight against Hale had been intense, but the victory was temporary. What had started as a quest for justice had turned into a deep-rooted mission. Hale's empire had fallen, but as Dwayne lay awake at night, the same thought haunted him. Hale was not the only one. The same kind of people, the same kind of dangerous minds, were out there, and they weren't going to give up just because one person was brought to justice. The world, it seemed, had a way of producing these kinds of men. Dwayne knew it was far from over. He wasn't sure where to start, or even how, but he couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something else, something darker, was about to unfold. Weeks passed, and the courtroom drama surrounding Hale's trial continued. The media's attention had turned into a frenzy, with each new detail about Hale's empire fueling public outrage. It felt like the whole world was watching, and for a moment, Dwayne allowed himself to enjoy the sensation of being on the winning side. But, as he sat in his car one evening, watching the rain beat against the windshield, his thoughts drifted back to those who had been caught in the crossfire of Hale's empire. The families who had lost loved ones in the fires. The workers, the everyday people who had been exploited and discarded. And yet, despite all of the destruction Hale had caused, there was still an underlying sense of calm in the air. It wasn't until the phone rang that Dwayne snapped out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen, Jessica's name flashing in bold letters. Dwayne picked up immediately. "Jess?" he said, trying to shake off the tension that had settled in his chest. "What's going on?" "Dwayne, I need you to listen." Jessica's voice was strained, tense, and Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. "Something's not right. I think we've been played." "What do you mean?" Dwayne's stomach twisted. "It's Hale," Jessica continued. "I've been looking deeper into his connections, his associates. There's something I missed. A larger network. Hale wasn't operating alone, and now that he's behind bars, they're starting to make their move." Dwayne's pulse quickened. "Who? Who's making their move?" "I don't have all the details, but I've uncovered some links to international organizations. People higher up. Much higher up than Hale," she said. "And the worst part is, they're not done. They're getting organized." Dwayne's mind raced, the pieces falling into place in a way he hadn't anticipated. Hale had been the tip of the iceberg, the visible manifestation of a much more dangerous system. If Hale had been connected to something larger, that meant Dwayne was no longer dealing with just one man. He was dealing with a web of corruption that stretched far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. "How bad is it?" Dwayne asked, keeping his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Jessica paused before answering. "I'm still digging, but I think this goes beyond just corporate corruption. There's money laundering, human trafficking, illicit trade. It's a network of people with vast resources. They won't hesitate to strike back now that Hale's gone." Dwayne felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't over. The storm had only just begun. The following days were a blur. Dwayne met with Jackson and Mike Taylor, who had become involved in the investigation again. They began pulling threads, tracking connections between Hale and other powerful figures, only to uncover a network that reached farther than they ever anticipated. Hale's operation had been a cog in a much larger machine, and now that the machine was missing a key player, there was a power vacuum. And power vacuums always meant trouble. "This isn't just about getting rid of one person," Mike said, looking over the new intel they'd gathered. "These people are organized, Dwayne. They're going to try to find a new leader, a new figurehead to control the flow of money and power. And they won't stop until they find it," Dwayne added grimly. "They'll come for anyone who gets in their way." The realization hit Dwayne like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting to keep the world from spiraling into chaos. But what made this fight different from the last one was that this time, he couldn't do it alone. Over the next few weeks, the operation became more complex. Dwayne's team expanded as they reached out to former allies, people who had once worked with Hale, trying to build a network of informants. But with each step forward, they encountered greater resistance. People were scared. These new players in the game weren't like Hale. They were more sophisticated, more covert. Dwayne could feel the danger closing in on them from all sides. At the same time, the walls around Hale's remaining empire began to shift. His loyalists, those who had remained in the shadows, waiting for the right moment, were starting to regroup. Dwayne had anticipated this, but the speed with which they were mobilizing shocked him. These people weren't just criminals. They were players on a global scale, with connections that went far beyond what Dwayne could have imagined. "I've been doing some digging," Jessica said, her voice crackling through the phone. "These people, they don't just want power. They want control. Control over everything. They've been quietly pulling strings in major industries, including agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and tech. This is bigger than anything Hale was ever a part of." Dwayne swallowed hard. "What are they planning?" "I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think this isn't about money anymore," Jessica replied. "It's about shaping the future. They're not just trying to survive. They're trying to rebuild the world in their image." The realization hit Dwayne like a shockwave. The people behind Hale weren't just criminals. They were masterminds, planning a massive global shift that could change everything. And if they succeeded, the world would never be the same. As the investigation deepened, Dwayne found himself at the center of a whirlwind. The stakes were higher than ever, but there was no going back. He had been right all along. Hale had been a part of something far more sinister, a far-reaching network that spanned continents and industries. And now, Dwayne had to stop it before it was too late. But time was running out. As he stood at the edge of the storm, Dwayne knew one thing for certain. He couldn't face this alone. The real battle was just beginning. And this time, the world's future was on the line. The storm was gathering, and Dwayne was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and countless hours spent poring over intel. Dwayne and his team were slowly piecing together a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every passing hour. It had become clear that the people Hale had worked with were no ordinary criminals. They were powerful, influential figures with the kind of reach that spanned continents. Their operation wasn't just about money or influence. It was about reshaping the global order itself. Dwayne couldn't help but wonder how deep this network went. And, more importantly, how many others were out there, just waiting for the right moment to take control. One afternoon, as Dwayne sat in the dimly lit room with Jackson, Mike, and Jessica, the weight of their situation hung heavy in the air. The information they had gathered so far painted a terrifying picture. These shadowy figures were working together to consolidate power, all while operating in the shadows. There were whispers of new alliances forming, factions vying for control in the wake of Hale's fall. "We need to move fast," Dwayne said, his voice steady but urgent. "We've exposed Hale, but these people? They're still out there, operating in the background. We have to hit them where it hurts before they regroup." Mike leaned forward, his expression grim. "We've been tracking some of their financial transactions, but they're sophisticated. These guys don't make a move without covering their tracks." Jessica, who had been silent for a while, spoke up. "There's something else. A name. I've been seeing it pop up in every connection I track, and it's like no one talks about it directly. But the more I dig, the more I'm convinced this person is at the top of it all." Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" "The name that keeps coming up is Silas Drake. I don't know much about him yet, but I'm starting to think he's the mastermind behind all of this." "Silas Drake." Dwayne repeated the name, letting it sink in. He didn't recognize it, but he could feel the weight it carried. The mastermind behind an international syndicate, a shadow figure pulling strings from the darkest corners of the world. And now, it seemed, they had found the puppet master. "We need to find him," Dwayne said firmly. "If we can take out Drake, we can cripple this whole operation." Mike shook his head. "It won't be that easy. People like Drake don't get found easily. He's as elusive as they come." Dwayne didn't back down. "Then we make him find us." The team worked tirelessly over the next few days, using every resource at their disposal to track down Silas Drake. Dwayne's mind was consumed with the hunt, but he knew that it wouldn't be enough to just expose him. They had to destroy the entire network before it could regroup, and for that, they needed leverage. They needed a game-changer. As Dwayne paced the room late one night, a thought struck him. What if we could turn someone from inside the operation? "Turn someone?" Jackson asked, looking skeptical. "You mean get an insider to help us?" "Exactly," Dwayne said. "Someone with access to the core of the operation. Someone who can give us the intel we need to take it all down." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "It's a risky move, Dwayne. Do you trust anyone inside this network?" Dwayne took a deep breath, thinking. "I trust one person. There's a man named Oliver Hayes. He used to work for Hale, but he left under suspicious circumstances. I don't know if he knows anything about Drake, but he might know something about how the operation works from the inside." Jackson frowned. "You're sure about this guy?" "I don't know," Dwayne admitted. "But if there's anyone who could be convinced to help us, it's him. He has a score to settle with Hale. Maybe we can use that." Jessica nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "All right. We find Oliver Hayes, we get him on our side, and we use him to track down Silas Drake. But we need to be careful. He might not be as trustworthy as you think." The next morning, Dwayne and Jackson made their way to the last known location of Oliver Hayes. It was a small apartment on the edge of the city, tucked away in a nondescript building. The air around them felt tense, as if they were walking into enemy territory, but Dwayne was resolute. He knew that if they could pull this off, they would have the leverage they needed. They knocked on the door. For a moment, there was no answer. Then, through the crack in the door, a pair of wary eyes appeared. "Dwayne," Oliver said, his voice low and guarded. "I didn't expect to see you again." Dwayne gave a tight smile. "It's been a while, Oliver. We need to talk." The door creaked open wider, and Oliver stepped aside to let them in. His apartment was modest, a stark contrast to the lavish life he'd once lived in Hale's world. It looked like Oliver had tried to distance himself from his past, but Dwayne could see the tension in his eyes. "What do you want?" Oliver asked, eyeing Dwayne warily. "We need your help," Dwayne said without preamble. "We're going after Silas Drake. We know you have connections to people who work with him. We're offering you a chance to settle the score." Oliver's eyes narrowed. "Drake? You've been digging into him?" "We've been digging into everyone. And Hale's just the tip of the iceberg. We need someone who knows how the operation works, someone who can help us bring it all down." Oliver hesitated, clearly conflicted. But Dwayne wasn't about to give up. He leaned in slightly, his tone softer now. "This is your chance, Oliver. You know what kind of man Hale was. You know how much destruction they've caused. You have the chance to make things right." Oliver's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Dwayne thought he was about to walk away. But then, something shifted in his expression. A glimmer of recognition, of understanding. "All right," Oliver said quietly, finally giving in. "I'll help you. But we're doing this my way." Dwayne nodded. "Of course. We're in this together." The alliance with Oliver marked the beginning of a new chapter in their fight. With his insider knowledge, they had access to crucial information. Slowly but surely, the walls around Drake's network began to crumble. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Silas Drake was even more dangerous than they had imagined. His influence reached far beyond what they had anticipated. Politicians, business magnates, underground leaders. It was a global web, and they were just beginning to unravel it. But even as Dwayne felt the pieces starting to fall into place, he knew the battle was far from over. Silas Drake wasn't just a man. They were dealing with an entire system, an empire that wouldn't go down without a fight. And as the storm continued to gather, Dwayne knew that this was just the beginning of an even greater fight. A fight for control, a fight for the future. But Dwayne was ready, and this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The alliance with Oliver Hayes had breathed new life into the investigation. With his insider knowledge, they began to see the structure of Silas Drake's empire with startling clarity. It wasn't just a network. It was a system, a machine, designed to operate in the shadows, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and power. Every day, Dwayne felt the growing urgency of the mission. Time was running out, and Drake's influence was spreading faster than they could track it. The operation was taking on a new level of complexity. Dwayne and his team had to be strategic, moving carefully to avoid tipping their hand. With every step they took, the danger increased. The people involved in Drake's syndicate were ruthless, and if they suspected they were being hunted, they wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. But Dwayne couldn't afford to back down. Not now. It had been 2 weeks since Oliver had agreed to help, and the information they'd uncovered was disturbing. The syndicate wasn't just involved in illegal trade. It was deeply embedded in legitimate businesses and governments. Drake was no longer a shadowy figure in the background. He was a puppet master, orchestrating a global web of corruption that touched nearly every corner of the world. "What's the next move?" Jackson asked one afternoon, looking over the mountain of data they'd gathered. Dwayne rubbed his temples. They had made progress, but it felt like they were chasing ghosts. "We need to get to the heart of it. We need to find where Drake's hiding, and we need to hit him hard. But we can't go in blind. We have to know his every move." Jessica, who had been quiet for most of the day, suddenly spoke up. "I've been analyzing the data, and there's one thing that keeps coming up. A facility, hidden away, deep in the mountains. It's not far from where Drake's operation is rumored to have started. It's isolated, off the grid. We haven't found a connection to it yet, but it's worth investigating." Dwayne leaned in, studying the map Jessica had pulled up. His gut told him that this might be the breakthrough they were waiting for. "What's the facility? A lab? A storage site?" "I don't know for sure, but I think it's where Drake's been pulling all his strings from. If we can get inside, we might find something that leads us directly to him." Oliver, who had been sitting silently in the corner, suddenly spoke. "It's a black site. I've heard rumors about it. It's not just a storage facility. It's where Drake keeps his most valuable assets. People. Information. It's his command center. Dwayne's instincts flared. If this was true, getting into that facility could give them the leverage they needed to finally take down Drake. But the thought of confronting him directly made Dwayne uneasy. These were not just criminals. They were organized, well-funded, and deeply connected. If they made a move too soon, it could be the end of everything they'd worked for. Do you think they'll have security? Dwayne asked Oliver, trying to gauge the level of risk involved. More than you can imagine, Oliver replied, his voice grim. Drake doesn't take chances. But if you're willing to take the risk, I can get you in. The thought of infiltrating a facility like this, full of unknown dangers, made Dwayne's pulse quicken. But he knew that they didn't have many options left. This was the chance they'd been waiting for, and they couldn't afford to waste it. We go in, Dwayne said decisively, but we do it smart. We gather as much intel as we can, and we don't engage unless we have to. If this is where Drake's pulling the strings, we'll find the evidence we need to bring him down. Jackson nodded. Got it. Let's do it. The days leading up to the operation were a blur of preparation. They had to be meticulous. Dwayne and the team spent hours assembling equipment, planning their route, and ensuring they could get in and out without alerting anyone. The mountains were treacherous, and the facility itself was fortified, but with Oliver's help, they had a shot. As they drove toward the location, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The world had felt off-kilter for weeks, and no matter how much he tried to prepare himself, the doubt lingered. The closer they got to the facility, the more unsettled he became. We're almost there, Oliver said, his voice tight with anticipation. Dwayne's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had seen danger before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about stopping a man. It was about stopping a global operation. The weight of that responsibility pressed on him like a vice. They arrived under the cover of night, parked a safe distance away, and began their descent toward the facility on foot. Every step was measured, every noise amplified in the silence of the mountain. Dwayne's mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. This wasn't just a mission. It was a fight for everything he had believed in. The facility was more heavily guarded than they had anticipated. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, and surveillance cameras were positioned at every corner. But Oliver had anticipated this. He led them through a series of underground tunnels that bypassed most of the security measures. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the darkness felt suffocating, but they pressed on. As they reached the heart of the facility, Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest. They were close. So close. Stay alert, Dwayne whispered to his team. We can't afford to get sloppy now. They moved through the facility with precision, using the cover of the shadows to avoid detection. The tension in the air was palpable, each step bringing them closer to their target. But the further they went, the more unsettling the place became. They passed rows of locked rooms, many of them filled with strange equipment and files that didn't belong in a place like this. Finally, they reached a central chamber. Dwayne motioned for everyone to stop. Inside, a massive computer system hummed, surrounded by monitors flashing with encrypted data. This was it, the heart of Drake's operation. Dwayne's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything that could give them the upper hand. We need to get into those files, he said, nodding toward the computer. Oliver moved swiftly, typing in commands as if he had done this 1,000 times before. I can crack it, but we don't have much time. They'll know we're here soon. As Oliver worked, Dwayne kept watch, every fiber of his being alert. This was their moment. They had come this far. Nothing could stop them now. Just as the last file was extracted, a loud alarm blared, echoing throughout the facility. They know we're here, Jackson growled. Time's up, Dwayne said, his voice steady. Get to the exit. Now. The team scrambled to their feet, but as they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. They weren't alone anymore. Dwayne's heart raced. The fight wasn't over yet. It had just begun. The blaring alarm tore through the silence, a sharp, insistent sound that echoed in Dwayne's ears. It was a signal, a warning that they were no longer undetected. The facility was on high alert, and the team had mere seconds to escape before they were trapped. We need to move now. Dwayne barked, his voice cutting through the panic that was beginning to set in. Jackson, ever the quick thinker, immediately led the way, signaling for the team to follow. Dwayne's heart raced as he glanced back at Oliver, who had just finished transferring the files to a secure drive. They couldn't afford to waste time. The enemy would be on them in minutes, if not seconds. The air in the facility felt colder, more oppressive as they rushed through the darkened hallways. Dwayne's mind was sharp, focused, but the tightness in his chest betrayed his fear. It wasn't just the danger of being caught. It was the knowledge that they had gathered information that could change everything, but they might not make it out alive to use it. "Down this way," Oliver shouted, pointing to an unmarked hallway. They dashed toward it, the distant sound of boots echoing louder as security forces closed in. The hallway was narrow, claustrophobic, and lit only by flickering fluorescent lights that seemed to mock their desperation. "Split up," Dwayne ordered, knowing they couldn't risk being cornered together. "We'll meet at the extraction point. Don't stop for anything." Jackson gave a quick nod and veered to the left, while Dwayne and Jessica sprinted to the right. Oliver hesitated for a moment before following Dwayne's lead, his eyes wide with the realization that their plan was falling apart faster than they could react. The corridors twisted and turned like a labyrinth, designed to disorient and confuse. Dwayne's breath came in short bursts as he rounded a corner, his shoes sliding slightly on the slick floor. He wasn't sure where they were anymore, just that they had to keep moving. Suddenly, a door ahead of him slammed open, and two armed guards rushed toward him. Instinctively, Dwayne dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the line of fire. The gunshots rang out, deafening in the narrow hallway. He had no choice. He returned fire, knocking one of the guards to the ground with a precise shot to the shoulder. The second guard fired back, missing by a hair as Dwayne darted behind a metal crate for cover. "Jessica!" Dwayne shouted, his voice urgent. "Move!" She was already several steps ahead, advancing toward the next corner as Dwayne suppressed another barrage of gunfire. He had only a few seconds before the guards regrouped, and he couldn't afford to be slowed down now. With a burst of adrenaline, Dwayne moved toward the next intersection, weaving between crates and machinery. He could hear the voices of more guards ahead. They were closing in. They had to escape. Oliver's footsteps echoed through the facility as he sprinted down another corridor, his mind racing. The sense of dread that had been gnawing at him only deepened as he considered the consequences of getting caught. If they didn't make it out with the files, all this would have been for nothing. Worse, if Drake's men captured them, it was clear that there would be no mercy. He glanced behind him, paranoid about any sudden movements. His heart pounded in his chest as he continued to run. The layout of the facility was starting to make sense to him again. A few more turns, and he would be in a narrow passage that led to the outer perimeter. That's where they had planned to meet. If they could just reach it. A sudden shout from behind him broke his concentration. He whipped around, his eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement. There. Two guards at the end of the hall, weapons raised. Oliver's pulse spiked. He ducked into a side room, praying he wasn't too late. Dwayne's thoughts were razor-sharp as he navigated the maze of the facility. He was aware of every sound. The pounding of his own heart, the sound of footsteps echoing behind him, the muffled voices calling to each other as they searched for him. It wasn't just the urgency of the mission that weighed on him. It was the heavy responsibility of it all. If they failed now, they were giving up the only chance to expose Drake's operation. They had worked so hard to get this far, and if they were caught, it would all be for nothing. He rounded another corner, nearly colliding with Jackson, who was panting heavily, his face streaked with sweat. The two exchanged a quick, silent look. There was no time for words. "We're almost there," Jackson said, his voice low. "Just a little farther." Dwayne nodded, gripping his gun tighter. "Let's move." The extraction point was just ahead, but the sound of pursuit was getting louder. Dwayne's mind raced as he led the team down another hallway, his senses on high alert. They were almost there. They could see the exit doors at the far end of the corridor. But as they neared the exit, the distinct sound of more footsteps reached Dwayne's ears. They were trapped. "Shit," Dwayne muttered. "We need cover now." Without thinking, he dove behind a large stack of crates, gesturing for the others to do the same. The guards were close now, too close. Dwayne's pulse quickened as the sound of boots echoed in the hallway. They had no choice but to fight their way out. "We don't have much time," Dwayne said, his voice strained. "On my signal, we move fast." The seconds stretched into eternity as the guards approached, their voices growing louder. Dwayne could hear them talking, too many of them. It wouldn't be easy to get past them. Dwayne held his breath, trying to steady his pulse. When the moment came, he had to be ready. "Now!" Dwayne shouted, bursting from his hiding place with Jackson and Jessica close behind. The guards had already rounded the corner, too late to react. Dwayne fired first, taking out the nearest guard with a swift, precise shot. The firefight was quick, but intense. Dwayne, Jackson, and Jessica moved as one, taking down their attackers with lethal precision. Their training kicked in, their movements fluid and coordinated. They didn't have time to hesitate. With the last of the guards taken care of, they sprinted for the exit. Dwayne's lungs burned as they finally burst through the door and into the night air. The cold hit him like a slap in the face, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins made everything feel surreal. As they reached the extraction point, they saw Oliver waiting for them, his eyes wide with relief. He didn't say anything. He just motioned for them to get in the vehicle. Dwayne jumped into the back seat, quickly followed by the others. "Go," he said, his voice firm. "Now." The vehicle sped away, leaving the facility behind them. But even as they drove towards safety, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just escaped the facility. They had escaped something much bigger, and they were now at the heart of the storm. The real battle was just beginning. As the vehicle sped through the mountainous terrain, Dwayne's thoughts were in overdrive. The escape had been harrowing, but they had made it. They were out of the lion's den, but the gravity of what they had uncovered weighed heavily on him. They were holding the key to something bigger than they had ever imagined, and the real question was, what would they do with it? Oliver sat beside Dwayne in the back of the vehicle, his eyes glued to the drive they had just extracted. His hands trembled as he flipped through the encrypted files on his laptop, his brow furrowing in concentration. The rest of the team was silent, the adrenaline slowly beginning to wear off, leaving them all exhausted. "This is bigger than I thought," Oliver said quietly, breaking the silence. Dwayne's eyes never left the road as he processed the words. "How so?" Oliver's voice was tense. "The data we pulled from that facility, it's not just about Drake. It's about a global network, a secret society that extends far beyond him. This isn't just organized crime. This is corruption on a scale I can't even begin to explain." Jessica, who had been staring out the window, turned toward him. "What are you saying? Is Drake just a pawn in this?" "Not just a pawn," Oliver replied, his eyes dark with the weight of what they were uncovering. "Drake is a key player, but there are people in positions of power all over the world who are working with him. Governments, corporations, people we'd never suspect. This syndicate is entrenched everywhere. It's a cancer that's eating away at everything." Dwayne's grip on the seat tightened. This was the moment he had feared. The realization that the fight they were engaged in wasn't just about stopping a villain. It was about dismantling an entire system. The team had made their way to a safe house several hours later, a secluded cabin far from the chaos they had just escaped. They needed time to regroup, to figure out what their next move would be. Dwayne paced the small living room, his mind racing. He had thought the mission was about bringing down Silas Drake, exposing his crimes. But now, it was clear that they were up against something far more insidious. If what Oliver was saying was true, they weren't just dealing with a criminal mastermind. They were up against a global conspiracy, one that had roots in some of the most powerful institutions in the world. The weight of it pressed on him like a physical force. How had it all come to this? How could something so monstrous exist in the shadows, unseen by the very people who were supposed to protect the world? Jackson broke the silence. "What now, boss? We can't just sit on this. We've got the files, but we don't know who to trust anymore. What if Drake has people everywhere? What if we're already too late?" Dwayne stopped pacing, his eyes meeting Jackson's. He could hear the fear in Jackson's voice, but he couldn't afford to give in to it. "We press forward," he said, his voice steady, but the uncertainty was there, lingering beneath the surface. We take this to the people who can help us bring it down, real authorities. We have to expose this, and we have to do it before it's buried forever. Jessica looked up from the laptop she had been studying, her expression serious. You're right, but we need to be careful. If we go public with this too soon, we could be playing right into Drake's hands. He'll know exactly what we're doing. I know, Dwayne muttered, his mind churning. We need to find someone we can trust. Someone with the power to make this go public, without putting us all in the crosshairs. Oliver, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. There's someone I can contact. A journalist, someone I've worked with in the past. They've been digging into Drake's operation for years, but they've never had enough proof to make a move. If we show them what we've got, they can blow this thing wide open. Dwayne's eyes locked onto Oliver's. Do it, but be careful. If this goes wrong, it could mean the end of everything. Oliver nodded solemnly. He understood the stakes. Hours later, as the team settled in, Dwayne found himself unable to sleep. His mind kept replaying the images of the facility, the guards, the firefight. He could still hear the echoes of the alarms, the way the walls seemed to close in on him as he ran through the hallways. It was as if the entire world had been collapsing around him, and he had no control over it. Sitting by the window, Dwayne stared out into the darkness. The world felt vast, unknowable. And yet, here he was, at the center of something that could change everything. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked to become embroiled in a global conspiracy. But the truth was undeniable. He had seen something no one else had. He had uncovered the hidden strings of power that held everything together. And now, there was no turning back. The following day, they met in the safe house's living room. Oliver had managed to make contact with the journalist, a woman named Rachel Cartwright. She had a reputation for investigating high-profile scandals, and if anyone could expose Drake's empire, it was her. I spoke with Rachel last night, Oliver said, looking at Dwayne. She's in. She wants to meet in person. She's already put her team on the story, but she needs to see the evidence herself. We're meeting her tomorrow morning. Dwayne nodded, his jaw clenched. It was the break they needed, but it also put them in a dangerous position. If Rachel Cartwright was the real deal, then they could trust her. But if she was compromised or had her own agenda, this could all go south very quickly. We can't afford mistakes, Dwayne said. We go in, show her what we have, and make sure she understands what's at stake. No one leaves until we're sure she's with us. The team nodded, their faces set in determination. They had come too far to turn back now. The next morning, they met Rachel Cartwright in a nondescript cafe on the edge of town. It was a small, quiet place, far from the prying eyes of anyone who might be watching. Dwayne, Jackson, Jessica, and Oliver sat at a corner table, waiting for Rachel to arrive. She was punctual, arriving exactly on time, dressed in a professional, no-nonsense outfit. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Dwayne didn't know what to make of her at first glance, but he had learned to trust his instincts, and something about Rachel gave him hope. She sat down across from them, her gaze flicking from one face to another before settling on Dwayne. I've read about you, Mr. Johnson, but I didn't expect to be sitting here, talking about global corruption. What exactly am I looking at? Oliver slid the drive across the table. This is it. All of it. The files. The names. The operation. It's all there. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just nodded and took the drive from the table, slipping it into her laptop. As the screen lit up and the files began to load, Dwayne felt the weight of the moment. This was it. The truth would finally be out. And with it, the world would change. Rachel didn't waste any time. She was already scrolling through the encrypted files on her laptop, her fingers moving swiftly over the keys. Dwayne watched her intently, trying to gauge her reaction, but her face was unreadable. The tension in the air thickened, and he could feel the weight of their mission pressing on him more than ever. This was the moment. If Rachel Cartwright wasn't on their side, they were all at risk. Jackson leaned forward, his eyes flicking to the laptop screen as if he could somehow read the files through sheer willpower. He spoke in a low voice, breaking the silence. Is it what we think it is? Rachel glanced up briefly, her expression unchanged. Worse. Far worse. Dwayne's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Rachel continued to scan through the data, her brow furrowing deeper. This goes deeper than I imagined. You were right about Drake, but it's not just him pulling the strings. He's part of something far larger, an underground network that spans multiple governments, global corporations, even intelligence agencies. They've been working in the shadows for years, building a system of control that extends to almost every corner of the globe. The realization hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a rogue criminal empire. They were dealing with an entire network that had infiltrated the highest echelons of power. The implications were staggering. His mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what they had uncovered. If this was exposed, it wouldn't just be Drake's fall from grace. It would be a worldwide reckoning. I knew it was big, but this is something else, Jackson muttered, rubbing his temples. Jessica, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and anger. How could we not have known about this? How did they keep it all under wraps for so long? Because they control the narrative, Rachel said matter-of-factly. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her eyes piercing through the group. And they've had help from people at every level, people in power who would do anything to keep the truth buried. This network isn't just about money or power. It's about creating a system where they control everything. Dwayne clenched his fists, feeling the fire of determination rising within him. They couldn't let this go unnoticed. They couldn't let these people get away with it. But he also knew they were facing a powerful enemy. The people behind this weren't just criminals. They were the ones who wrote the rules. And going against them would be like playing a game with no rules at all. So, what do we do now? Dwayne asked, his voice steady, though his mind was still racing. Rachel's eyes softened for a moment as she considered the question. First, we get this information into the right hands. But we have to be careful. If we go public too soon, we risk making ourselves targets. We need a strategy, a way to ensure that when the truth comes out, it sticks. Dwayne nodded. He had expected as much. They couldn't afford to rush this. Do you have any ideas? Oliver asked, his voice low. Rachel's gaze sharpened again as she began typing on her laptop. I've got contacts, journalists, politicians, whistleblowers, but we'll need to be careful about who we trust. The people behind this network are everywhere. We'll need a coordinated effort, but we can't tip our hand yet. Dwayne sat back, his mind whirring as he processed the enormity of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about taking down Drake. It was about exposing an entire system, a shadow government that had infected the heart of the world's power structures. The mission had changed. Now, it was about survival, and a battle that could alter the course of history. The hours that followed were a blur. They spent the next several days in the safe house, strategizing, contacting people who might help them, and slowly mapping out their next moves. Rachel worked tirelessly, using her connections to reach out to key individuals who could help bring the information to light. Meanwhile, the team kept a low profile, knowing that at any moment, Drake's forces could track them down. Dwayne found himself more and more restless. It wasn't just the knowledge that their every move was being watched. It was the weight of the mission. They were on the precipice of something massive. But with every decision they made, they could be sealing their fate. Rachel's updates were both encouraging and unsettling. She had managed to contact several high-profile journalists who were already working on similar stories, but there were roadblocks at every turn. The people behind this global network had their fingers in every pie: media, law enforcement, the military, and the highest levels of business and politics. Rachel's voice broke through his thoughts one morning as they sat around the kitchen table. I've got a meeting set up, a secure one. We can't do this alone anymore. I've reached out to a former government insider. He's willing to meet, but it's going to be risky. Dwayne stood up from the table, feeling the familiar surge of urgency. Who is he? His name is Ethan Carter, Rachel replied. He used to work in national security. He's one of the few who knows how deep this runs. He's a whistleblower who tried to expose the network years ago, but he was silenced. If we can get him on our side, he could be the key to bringing this all down. Dwayne nodded. Where's the meeting? Underground. We'll have to travel discreetly. I'll give you the details when the time comes. As Rachel stood and gathered her things, Dwayne looked around at his team. They had come so far, but now it felt like they were standing on the edge of a precipice. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about a mission anymore. It was about taking on an entire system that had been in place for decades. It was about shaking the foundations of power itself. And for Dwayne, it was personal. He wasn't just fighting for the truth. He was fighting for a world where people didn't have to live in fear, where corruption didn't rule every aspect of life. This was the fight of their lives. Later that evening, Dwayne stood on the porch of the safe house, looking out into the darkness. His mind kept returning to the faces of the people he had met during this journey. The ones who had helped, the ones who had betrayed them, and the ones they had yet to face. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into enemy territory. But he wasn't afraid. No matter what happened, no matter how deep the web of deception went, they would expose the truth. Because in the end, truth was the only weapon they had. And with it, they would bring down the empire. The next few days were filled with anticipation and unease. Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every passing hour seemed to stretch endlessly before them, and with each moment, the shadow of the global network they were up against loomed larger. But they couldn't afford to waste any time. Every piece of intel, every contact, every move had to be deliberate and calculated. One mistake, and the whole operation could unravel. Rachel had set up a meeting with Ethan Carter, the former national security insider who had tried to expose the corruption years ago. She'd been meticulous in arranging it, and the place she had chosen for their encounter was a remote, heavily guarded location. A place where they could speak without the constant fear of eavesdropping. Dwayne didn't like the secrecy of it all, but he understood the need for caution. The last thing they wanted was for the people behind the conspiracy to find out what they were up to. The team sat in a nondescript van parked on the outskirts of a secluded warehouse district, their eyes darting between the screens in front of them. Rachel had already gone inside to prepare for the meeting, and the rest of the team was left to keep watch. It was an unusually quiet day, almost too quiet. But that was the nature of the job. Silence before the storm. Dwayne glanced at the clock. The time had come. Jackson, who was sitting in the front seat, was the first to speak. Everything's set. We stay here, keep an eye on things. If anything feels off, we bail. We're not risking it. Dwayne nodded. Agreed. We can't take any chances. If things go south, we get Rachel out and head straight for the backup route. Jessica checked her gun and then her phone. We'll be ready. But something about this doesn't sit right. Carter's a whistleblower, right? Why would he wait so long to speak up? It's a good question, Dwayne replied. But right now, we can't afford to question motives. If he's legit, he's our only shot at bringing this down. If he's not, then we'll have to deal with that when the time comes. The tension in the van thickened as the minutes ticked by. Dwayne's mind kept circling back to the enormity of what they were facing. It wasn't just about stopping Silas Drake anymore. The revelations had taken on a much darker tone. The network was vast, everywhere, entrenched in the very fabric of the world's systems. Governments, corporations, intelligence agencies. They had their hands in everything. They controlled not just the flow of information, but the very narrative of the world. And that made them incredibly dangerous. Rachel's voice crackled through the earpiece. Dwayne, I'm inside. The room's secure. We'll talk soon. Dwayne nodded, though no one could see him. He spoke into the mic, understood. Stay sharp. He glanced at the monitors again, watching for any signs of movement. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the district. It was the perfect cover for anyone who wanted to move unnoticed, and Dwayne couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. They had come this far, but they were still a long way from victory. And this meeting with Carter could either be the breakthrough they needed or the beginning of their downfall. Inside the warehouse, Rachel was seated across from Ethan Carter. He was a man in his mid-40s, his face weathered and worn from years of service to a government he once believed in. His eyes were sharp, and there was a caution in them that spoke of the dangers of his past. He'd lived under the radar for years, a ghost in the system, but now he was being pulled back into the fight. Rachel had made sure to meet in a space with no cameras, no hidden microphones. Even in this room, she couldn't let her guard down. She didn't know what Carter's true motivations were, but she had no choice but to trust him for now. The information he held could be the key to unraveling everything. Carter studied Rachel with a wary look as she set down the encrypted files. I'll be honest with you, Cartwright. I didn't expect this. When I heard from you, I thought it was a trap. But I've seen the proof now. You weren't lying. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. No, I wasn't. And now, it's your turn to help. You know what's at stake. You've seen it firsthand. Carter leaned forward, his voice dropping. I've seen more than I ever wanted to. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The network you're up against is far bigger than you think. It's not just a criminal syndicate. It's an entire system, an invisible government that operates behind every major decision in this country and beyond. And it's not just the power brokers in Washington. It's global. Every part of the world is affected by this, from the tech companies in Silicon Valley to the halls of power in Europe and Asia. It's all connected. Rachel nodded, keeping her composure. We know that now. We're trying to expose them, but we need your help. We need to know who's really behind it all and how they're controlling everything. Carter hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mix of guilt and anger. I tried to warn people. I did everything I could to get the truth out before they silenced me. I had access to everything, intel, communications, operations. But every time I got close to blowing the lid off, they came for me. They threatened me, my family. They made sure I understood just how far their reach went. I went underground to protect myself, but they're everywhere, Cartwright. Rachel leaned in, her voice firm. And now, you're ready to fight back? Carter's gaze hardened. I have no choice. I spent years watching this corruption destroy everything I worked for, everything I believed in. But I know how they operate now. I can help you. Rachel exhaled, a sense of relief washing over her. This was it. They had an insider who knew how to navigate the very system they were trying to dismantle. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was their best shot. We need a plan, Rachel said. You said you know how they operate. What do we need to do to expose them? Carter's eyes narrowed as he considered the question. We go after their communication network first. The one they use to coordinate everything. World leaders, CEOs, corrupt officials. It's all digital, encrypted, and it's the lifeblood of the entire operation. If we can crack it, we can tear everything down. Rachel nodded. We already have part of it. The files you've seen. Those are just the beginning. We need your expertise to crack the rest. Carter gave a grim smile. You'll have it, but it won't be easy. They'll know we're coming. And when they do, they'll come for all of us. Rachel stood, her voice unwavering. Then we'll be ready. Outside the warehouse, Dwayne and the team kept watch, the tension rising with each passing minute. The waiting was the hardest part. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet they knew the true danger hadn't even begun. When Rachel returned, she would bring with her not just Carter's expertise, but a way forward. A path to exposing the global network that had been hidden for so long. As Dwayne looked out the van's window, his thoughts turned to the future. This was a fight they couldn't back down from. The stakes had been raised higher than ever, and the people behind this system of control wouldn't stop until they had crushed anyone who stood in their way. But Dwayne wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. And with Ethan Carter's help, they were about to take their first real step toward bringing the whole thing down. The next few days felt like a blur of preparation, the urgency increasing with each passing moment. Dwayne, Rachel, and the team worked around the clock, trying to stay one step ahead of the forces hunting them, all while piecing together the intricate web of corruption they were attempting to expose. It was a delicate dance, gathering the right information, ensuring their safety, and laying the groundwork for what would hopefully be their final strike against the global network. Rachel's meeting with Ethan Carter had given them the breakthrough they needed. The former insider's knowledge was invaluable. He had once been on the inside, privy to the encrypted communications that bound the network together, and he knew exactly how to infiltrate it. His expertise was the missing puzzle piece that would allow them to access the rest of the information they needed to bring the entire operation crashing down. But with the knowledge came new risks. The more they learned, the more dangerous the situation became. Carter's warnings echoed in Dwayne's mind. They'll come for you. They're everywhere. The network had eyes everywhere, hidden cameras, wiretaps, informants. The moment they exposed their plans, the people behind this corruption would strike back, and they would strike hard. It wasn't just the physical danger that worried Dwayne. It was the psychological toll. The more they uncovered, the more Dwayne realized just how much power the network truly held. It wasn't just about money or influence. It was about control. They had infiltrated every layer of society: governments, corporations, militaries, and even media outlets. The scale was unimaginable, and yet, it was all real. But Dwayne wasn't one to back down from a fight, and now, with Ethan Carter's help, they were poised to strike at the very heart of the conspiracy. It was late in the evening when Rachel called for a meeting at the safe house. Dwayne, Jackson, Jessica, and Oliver gathered around the table, all their faces etched with exhaustion and determination. The screens were filled with codes, maps, and communications, documents they had gathered over the past few days, each piece of the puzzle slowly coming together. "We've been able to access more of their communication network," Rachel said, her voice low and focused. "We've cracked some of their encryption, enough to know who's involved. But we're still missing the last key, the mastermind behind it all." Dwayne leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "What do we know so far?" Rachel clicked through the files on her laptop, bringing up a series of names and connections. "This," she said, highlighting a list of people. "These are the key players. High-ranking officials, CEOs, military leaders. They're all connected to Drake in one way or another. But the final piece, the person orchestrating everything, the one pulling the strings, is still hidden. We know it's not just Drake anymore. There's someone at the top, someone whose name has been carefully kept out of the public eye." Dwayne's mind was racing. Who could be powerful enough to operate in the shadows, hidden from the world's scrutiny? The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like they were up against something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. "I want to find out who this person is," Dwayne said, his voice steady. "And I want to know how we can expose them." Rachel nodded. "We have one chance to get this right. We need to access their main database. There's a server deep within their system that holds the last bit of information we need. It's highly secured, but Carter thinks he can help us break in." Carter, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, spoke up. "I can get us access. But once we're in, there's no turning back. They'll know we're coming, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Dwayne's gaze shifted to Carter, sizing him up. There was no question about it. They needed him. And yet, a part of Dwayne couldn't ignore the nagging doubt in the back of his mind. Could they trust him completely? Could they trust anyone in this game? But there was no time for hesitation. "We do it tonight. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." Jackson, ever the pragmatist, crossed his arms. "How are we getting in?" "We'll need to infiltrate one of their secure facilities," Rachel said. "It's heavily guarded, but we can use the access codes we've found to slip through the perimeter. Once we're inside, Carter will guide us to the server. But the moment we're inside, we'll have to move quickly." Jessica glanced at the others, a mixture of concern and determination on her face. "And if we're discovered?" Carter's eyes darkened. "Then we run. Fast. And we hope we're good enough to get out before they catch up." The night air was thick with tension as Dwayne and the team geared up. They had everything they needed: night vision goggles, secure comms, and the necessary equipment to break into the facility. But there was no denying the weight of what they were about to do. They were about to strike at the heart of the conspiracy, and if they succeeded, it would be a game changer. But if they failed, it could mean the end of everything. As the team made their way toward the facility, Dwayne's mind raced. He thought about the countless people who had already suffered at the hands of the network. Victims who had been silenced, manipulated, and erased. He thought about the larger fight they were all involved in. A fight for truth, justice, and freedom. This was more than just about taking down one criminal. This was about ending the stranglehold that these shadowy powers had on the world. But as they approached the facility, the reality of the situation hit home. The facility was massive, surrounded by high walls and armed guards at every entrance. Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a heist, it was a war. Rachel turned to him, her face illuminated by the dim light of her helmet. "This is it, Dwayne. We either get in and get out clean, or we're in for a world of hurt." Dwayne met her gaze, his voice steady. "We'll get it done." Trust me." With that, they moved toward the facility, their steps silent, their nerves steeled. Every part of the mission had been meticulously planned. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. As they crept toward the perimeter, Dwayne's thoughts flickered back to the people they were trying to save. The world had to know the truth. And if this mission succeeded, the world would never be the same again. This was their chance, and they weren't about to let it slip away. Inside the facility, time moved in slow motion. The hum of machinery echoed through the cold concrete walls as the team moved through the darkened hallways, following the map Carter had provided. Every door, every hallway felt like a potential trap, but they kept moving. They couldn't afford to stop, not even for a second. As they reached the server room, the door loomed ahead, heavy, reinforced, and locked. Carter stepped forward, his hands moving quickly over the access panel. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and the door creaked open. Inside, rows upon rows of servers blinked in the dim light, each one a piece of the massive network they were trying to expose. Rachel moved quickly, setting up her laptop and connecting it to the main system. The moment the connection was made, Carter's voice came through their comms. "This is it. We're in." For a moment, everything was silent. Dwayne's pulse raced as Rachel typed furiously, bypassing firewalls and security protocols. The moment they accessed the last bit of data, the final piece of the puzzle, the whole system would collapse. Then, the alarms began to blare. "Shit," Jackson muttered. "We've been made." "Get ready," Dwayne said, as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. The countdown had begun. There was no turning back now. The alarms screamed through the facility, a deafening wail that sent adrenaline flooding through Dwayne's veins. Every second felt like an eternity as the team scrambled into action. The mission had reached its critical moment. They were in, too deep to back out now. The final piece of the puzzle was within their grasp, but so was their downfall. "Get the data, Rachel," Dwayne barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We don't have much time." Rachel's fingers flew over the keyboard, her face tense with concentration. "Almost there," she muttered under her breath. The screen in front of her flashed, displaying rows of encrypted files, each more important than the last. They had the names, the connections, the transactions. They had everything they needed to take down the global network and expose it to the world. But time was running out. The sound of boots pounding down the hall was growing louder. The guards were closing in fast. Jackson was already moving, checking his weapon and scanning the corridor through the night vision scope. "We're about to have company. We need an exit plan, and we need it now." "Rachel," Dwayne called, his voice tight with urgency. "How much longer?" Rachel's fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before she looked up, eyes wide. "I've almost got it, but I can't upload it without clearing the security encryption first. It's going to take a few more minutes." Dwayne's heart thudded in his chest. They didn't have a few more minutes. "We don't have that long," Jackson snapped, his voice cold. "The whole building's going to be on lockdown in less than 3 minutes. After that, we're trapped." Dwayne's mind raced, calculating every possible option. The risk of staying was too great. If they didn't get out now, they might never have another chance. "Rachel, pull everything you can. Right now, even if it's not fully decrypted," Dwayne ordered. "Just get us the files. We'll figure out the rest later." Rachel hesitated. She knew it wasn't ideal, but she didn't have a choice. She hit a few more keys, and then, with a quick breath, hit send. The laptop screen blinked, confirming the files had been uploaded. Rachel wasted no time in closing her laptop, grabbing it from the desk, and securing it in her bag. She met Dwayne's eyes. "It's done," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Let's get out of here." Dwayne didn't waste another second. "Move out," he shouted, his heart racing as he led the charge toward the exit. The hallway ahead was lined with guards, their silhouettes visible through the smoke-filled air and the flickering emergency lights. "We're going to have to fight our way out," Jackson muttered, his gun at the ready. "I'll take the left, you take the right." Dwayne nodded. "Jessica, cover us. Carter, stay low and follow Rachel." They knew their escape wouldn't be easy. There was no room for mistakes. One wrong move, and they'd be surrounded, captured, or worse. Jackson and Dwayne split off, moving in synchronized silence. They made it to the first intersection in the hall, where they encountered their first wave of guards. Without hesitation, Dwayne and Jackson opened fire, each taking down a guard with practiced precision. The sound of gunshots echoed in the narrow hallway, the tension sharp as a blade. "Go, go, go!" Dwayne shouted as they moved, taking cover behind a row of steel lockers. Jessica's sharp eyes scanned the hallway for any signs of more threats. Every second felt like an eternity. The hallway was a maze of security doors, narrow spaces, and dead ends. But they kept pushing forward. Carter was keeping pace with Rachel, his eyes darting nervously as they followed the others. "The exit's just ahead," he said, his voice strained. "We can make it if we keep moving." But as they rounded the corner toward the exit, Dwayne's stomach sank. The door was blocked. More guards, more guns. "Damn it!" Jackson cursed under his breath. "We're surrounded." The team froze, their escape cut off. In the distance, the sound of reinforcements was already drawing closer. They had no time to hesitate. "Move back," Dwayne shouted, taking command once again. "We're not going to get out this way. We need another route now." Rachel glanced at Carter, her face set in determination. "Where's the backup escape route?" Carter's expression turned grim. "There's a service elevator, but it's a few floors down. It leads to a maintenance tunnel. If we can make it there, we can get out unnoticed. But it's a risk." "Lead the way," Dwayne said. "We'll cover you." Carter didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted down the hallway, the team following closely behind him. They moved quickly but carefully, dodging around corners and keeping their heads low. Behind them, the sound of shouting guards echoed in their ears, getting closer and closer. The service elevator was just ahead. Carter yanked open a metal door, revealing a narrow shaft. The elevator itself was old, rusted in places, and there was no guarantee it would even work, but it was their only shot. "Everybody in now," Dwayne ordered. One by one, the team crowded into the small elevator, weapons at the ready. Jackson hit the button for the lowest floor. The elevator creaked and groaned as it began its descent, and Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to their capture, or worse. The elevator finally came to a halt with a shudder, and the doors opened into a dark maintenance tunnel. The team spilled out, ready to make their final push for freedom. Carter led them down the dimly lit corridor, the air damp and cold. They could hear the distant sound of boots pounding the floors above them, but for now, they were safe. The tunnel ahead was their only way out, and with the files in hand, they couldn't afford to slow down. They were on the edge of exposing the truth, but they were also facing the most dangerous moment of their mission. They moved as fast as they could, the tunnel stretching out endlessly in front of them. The tension was palpable, every step forward a gamble with their lives. They had come so far, but they were still a long way from victory. The exit was in sight, just a few more turns, and they would be free. But as they rounded one last corner, they found themselves face to face with the enemy. The tunnel had been compromised. A group of armed men stood in their path, blocking the exit. Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the final stand. There was no more room to run. It was time to fight for everything they had worked for. "Move in," Dwayne ordered, his voice cold with resolve. And just like that, the fight for the truth began. The team was ready, and they would do whatever it took to make sure the truth came to light. Because they knew that if they failed, the world would never know the horrors that lay hidden in the shadows. And they couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not ever.